What do we want to talk about?
I am him. I am him.
Hey, this is the Red Carpet Ring featuring TBK, the Turnbuckle King. Got another good one for you guys today. We got a continuation of Ronda Rousey, Our Fight, a Memoir Book, audio 2024. Now, last time we was coming up on chapter 7. As you all know, that Ronda Rousey just released a brand new audio book. This is from the New York Times bestselling author and trailblazing athlete Ronda Rousey. You know, an unfiltered chronicle of lost resilience and finding meaning in life's journey. And she talks about her MMA scene, later WWE. She explores the greatest challenge of her life and how she rebuilt her life onto something better in the aftermath. But this is a continuation of the book, audiobook that was released April 2nd. So this is definitely a good audiobook thus far. I know she's gone off her current loss and how she had to take time away and focus, get herself together, and definitely make sure her mind was right mentally, physically, everything. But with that being said, we'll continue on with this audiobook. I hope you guys enjoy. You guys leave comments in the live chat and also in the comment section below what you think of the book thus far. Are you Ronda Rousey fans or are you not so Ronda Rousey fans? But I would like to definitely interested into hearing what you guys have to say regarding the audiobook, Ronda Rousey, Our Fight, a Memoir Book, audio 2024. With that being said, let's continue on with the audiobook. You guys enjoy. Like and subscribe as well and keep the notification bell on. We'll have part 3 and next after this. So keep the notifications out. It will be coming soon.
Seven. Every few weeks, Dana would check in on me. In the beginning, it was the standard, just wanted to see how you're doing. If I was healing up, how I was feeling, how deep in the dark place I was. After a few months had passed, he asked the question that I knew was coming. Are you ready to come back? The answer was no. On a physical recovery level, it took 6 months for my loose teeth to heal to the point where I could bite an apple. I underwent my 7th knee surgery, attempting to repair ligament damage with my own stem cells. It turned out I had torn the last shreds of my ACL when I knocked myself out on the stairs. Beyond all that, my body had spent over 5 years taking relentless beatings and training. I had lost any sense of what it felt like to wake up in the morning and not ache. But I knew that anything physical I could push through. It was everything else that made the idea of returning to fighting feel unbearable. It had been almost a year since I last stepped in the cage. Dana and I were out to dinner in LA, and inevitably, the subject of my return hung over the conversation. Where are you at? He asked me, referring to my mental state, obviously, as I was physically sitting across the table from him. I sighed. I don't know. A lot of that post-fight year had been defined by I don't know. I knew I had to come back, but I didn't know if I wanted to. I felt like I owed it to Dana. I felt like I owed it to the fans. I felt like I owed it to the world to fight again and be an example of coming back from adversity. How could I face the gauntlet of press and daily demands to discuss my last loss without telling the truth? My brain had taken too much trauma to fight at the top level anymore. I could barely take a jab without being dazed. What do you need? Dana asked. What can we do? I thought for a moment. Listen, any bitch on earth walks in this front door, I'll beat the shit out of her right now, I said, gesturing to the entrance of the restaurant. But I can't go through weeks of interrogations about my last match, under the guise of promoting the next one. I just can't go through that right now. I don't know if I ever can. Dana leaned forward, nodding. He's a businessman and a promoter, so the wheels are always turning. My title run as a UFC bantamweight champion had spanned nearly 3 years and 6 UFC title fights. But in the months following, it had ping-ponged around the division. First to Home, who turned around and lost it to Misha. Pulling off an upset is one thing, establishing a title reign is another. Dana had approached me about a possible Misha rematch, but I was still healing at that point. And the last thing I wanted was to jump into a months-long media blitz with Misha smugly holding a belt that she'd never have been able to take from me. You can have the winner of Misha and Amanda Nunes if you want it, he now offered. It would be the New Year's card, he said, and yes, he promised, it would be New Year's this time, not moved up on short notice like the home fight. I was still hesitant. I didn't want to have to sit through press event after press event, interview after interview, and be dissected and cross-examined, especially when the true answers were ones I couldn't give if I still wanted to be a fighting athlete. I couldn't get up there and lie, but I also couldn't go out there and tell the truth. After my loss, I saw how quickly the media turned on me. Running to them crying about my concussion history would be seen as excuses by people who didn't understand the actual impact that kind of damage can have. And for any future opponent, that information would be the equivalent of pointing a flashing hit here arrow right at my head. The home loss, almost everyone believed, as the betting odds for my next fight would prove, was a fluke. What I saw as one of the worst moments of my life, the media saw as a ratings opportunity. There was giddiness around witnessing my failure, to see them flip from Ronda is unbeatable to we saw the cracks faster than it takes to change a channel. I used to laugh about how people chalked up my success to being a one-trick pony, that trick being the armbar, until I started knocking people out to end fights. But in losing, they talked about me as if I was a racehorse. Actually, if I'd been a favored racehorse, the media gallery would have said things like, "Oh, this is tragic, I hope she's okay." For my entire career in the UFC, I felt indebted to Dana for believing in me, to the fans for watching me, to the media for covering me. And while I felt that I had an obligation to fight one more time for Dana and the fans, I didn't feel like I owed the media shit. They had no real incentive to help me convey the cumulative weight of the last years. I'd spent a year either high or reevaluating, and during that time, I reflected on how unhappy dealing with the media made me. I couldn't help but ask myself, why am I taking part in this cycle that is sucking so much of my time, energy, and mental bandwidth, yet pays me nothing while making millions of dollars for the people who twist my words to talk shit about me? I can fight, I explained. I just don't want to go through the fucking circus of everything before. Then skip it, Dana says. You don't have to do any of it. You don't have to do any media. You don't have to do any press conferences. You don't have to do fucking anything. Just show up and fight. I bit my bottom lip, unconsciously poking my tongue into the fleshy indent. Knowing the promotional expectations of top-of-the-card fighters, I had been all but certain Dana would never agree to my terms. He had previously pulled Nick Diaz from a fight card when Nick failed to show up to do media. Okay, I said reluctantly. I'll think about it. It was the first time I didn't say yes to Dana immediately. A huge grin spread across Dana's face. He knew before I did that I meant yes. After we finished eating and stood up to leave, he gave me a hug. Just give me a call when you're ready, he said. I got in the car and stared out the windshield. I didn't think I'd ever really be ready to fight again. For an entire year, when will Ronda return had been hanging over my head, following me like Eeyore's rain cloud. I just wanted to get it over with. And the longer I was away, I was just getting rustier. I watched the fight. Misha lost, bloodied and tapping to Nunes in the first round. Her title run coming to an end before it had ever truly began. Just like home. Nunes was 13-4 as a professional fighter, but 3 of her 4 losses were to chicks I'd beat in a combined total of 55 seconds. But a champion's one advantage over the contender lies in their confidence. Nunes' confidence skyrocketed after winning the title, and I knew every win she racked up would only make her even tougher to beat. She was only going to get better. It was now or never. Right after the Nunes-Tate fight, I called Dana. Go ahead, I said, book the fight. The truth is, if I hadn't felt like I still owed a comeback to Dana and the fans, I easily could have walked away after the home fight. My goal of perfection destroyed, there was nothing left in the fight game for me. But I viewed being a champion as almost a public service. The first time around, I had been chasing perfection, but maybe greater lessons could be learned from overcoming adversity, I told myself. Maybe this was the role I was called upon to play. In October, the UFC announced Nunes and I would be headlining the New Year's Eve fight card. She was the reigning champion, but the promotional posters blared the words, "She's back." Save for the occasional hike, it had been almost a year since I'd last worked out. I don't mean that in a, oh, this old thing gestures to self wearing a ball gown type of way. I mean in a lying on the couch playing World of Warcraft, cuddling with my dog, and eating crepes for a year type of way. Well, sometimes I'd get high and go in the garage and do Pilates, but I don't think that counts. When I finally got back into the gym, I was amazed by how much that year off helped my body. I bounced back into shape almost immediately. For the first time in as long as I could remember, the end of practice wasn't marked by constant pain and exhaustion. Soreness, sure, but not pain. True to his word, Dana didn't ask me to talk to anyone, which only made people talk about me more. And yet, as I went through camp, it felt like I was just going through the motions. The process wasn't fun anymore. I called the weeks in the lead up to a fight montage time because if life were a movie, this time frame would be condensed down to a series of quick clips set to motivational music building up to a dramatic showdown. During training, I would envision it as a montage in my mind, but instead of hearing Eye of the Tiger, the music in my head was a lot of sad Simon and Garfunkel. I didn't dare say it out loud, but I was dreading the entire thing. I was coming back for Dana, I was coming back for the fans, but I wasn't coming back for me. Once again, I found myself repeating, "Best on your worst day," until I realized that at some point during camp, I was now saying, "Every day is my worst day, and I just got to be the best anyway." From a technical perspective, camp was going flawlessly, but I was self-conscious about my ability to operate under the risk of getting hit. I wanted to put as much real risk in my sparring as possible. I treated every single hit like it could knock me out, because it could. Fighting is a brutal sport, and because of this, when you're training, the risk of injury is too high if you do things exactly like you would in competition. Instead, training is more of a simulation where you stop just before you fully execute. You don't throw a punch as hard as you plan to in a cage unless you're wearing bigger gloves. You don't take hits unless you're wearing headgear. You don't crank an armbar as much as you will on fight night. You have to find this sweet spot where you're not trying to hurt the other person and not letting that restraint become a habit. That balance between skill and holding back is even more important when it comes to your sparring partners. For high-level fighters, training partners are some of the most unsung heroes. They are typically elite fighters themselves who are brought in and paid to help prepare a fighter. They come to work with the understanding that, despite protective measures, their job is, in part, to take a beating. Training partners can vary from camp to camp, depending on what your opponent's strengths may be. In MMA, they can also vary from discipline to discipline, such as kickboxing or grappling. In my previous camps, we would practice in parts and protection. I would do stand-up boxing sparring, but with bigger gloves that didn't make it possible to go directly from standing into grappling. Then I'd do grappling training with smaller gloves that made it possible to do takedowns. I'd show my strikes, basically tap the other person, instead of delivering full blows. It was the same thing on the ground, where I'd mime blows rather than deliver them. The protective gear felt bulky, but it was the best we can do to avoid injury and having to postpone the fight or fight injured. This time around, the gloves semi-literally came off. I trained solely with fight gloves. One of the main reasons you don't train with actual fight gloves is an increased risk of getting cut. With less padding and more exposure, there's also a greater chance you can injure your hand. Considering I had to have surgery for breaking my thumb after knocking out Alexis Davis in my 4th UFC fight, I was well aware of how real that risk was. The biggest threat in this fight with Nunes was being caught again. Training is structured around not having to worry about being dealt a knockout blow, which is the exact thing I needed to be worried about heading into the fight. She had a headhunting style where she constantly swung for the fences at your face. It backfired on her before in her losses, but I didn't have the capacity to stand in the pocket with her the way someone like Alexis Davis or Kat Zingano could. We brought in sparring partners who were ranked UFC fighters, like Raquel Pennington, who had been on Misha's team in The Ultimate Fighter and had since made a career for herself. We brought in guys who were about my size, but who could throw harder punches than any female opponent would. I wore MMA practice gloves, which at 6 ounces are 2 ounces heavier than fight gloves, but they protected my thumbs and were still about half the weight of boxing sparring gloves. I went without headgear. I needed to have the confidence that when I stepped into the cage, I was truly ready for whatever was coming at me. I needed the reps of keeping my hands closer to my face than headgear would allow. I needed to prepare as if a single punch could be the end of the world. I couldn't afford to take any more hits, even in the gym. I needed to know I could still be in there with the best and not let them touch me. It was a big risk, but I did extremely well in those sparring sessions. I was going in and dropping people to the ground. My transitions were quicker and tighter than ever, tapping everyone out with ease. People would later question my training camp, but it was technically one of the best. But mentally, I wasn't fighting to win. I was fighting not to lose. Although imperceptible to anyone watching, the physical dominance I was showing in the cage was powered and driven by fear of losing my legacy instead of pursuing greatness. The day of the weigh-ins, I walked out to the roar of the crowd in Vegas. It was the first time I had stood before that many people since Australia. As the challenger, I stepped on the scale first. I made weight and smiled. Cutting weight for the Nunes fight was one of the easiest weight cuts I ever had. I walked over to the side of the stage to redress. I pulled my jeans back on and bent down to put on my shoes when I heard them announce words that I had only heard attributed to me in person. Joe Rogan's voice echoed from the arena speakers, and now the reigning, defending, undisputed UFC bantamweight champion of the world. I looked up to see my opponent climbing the stairs. Or I assumed it was her. I couldn't be certain, given that the woman walking up to the stage was wearing a cheap lion mask that looked like she'd grabbed it at a post-Halloween clearance sale. She stepped on the scale, turned, and, I guess, looked at me. At least, the little plastic eyes on her lion mask were pointed in my direction, the pink painted tongue hanging from the mouth. We squared up for the requisite pre-showdown face-off, until Dana said, "You're good," signaling we could break. I turned and walked off stage to a cheering arena, leaving the faux feline fighter to handle the interviews. That night, my mom came by my room. We lay on the bed of my suite, and she told me all the reasons why I was going to win. For the first time adding, "and because you're not so ugly that you need to hide behind a stupid lion mask," to the list. The next day, the warm-up was great. I had the right mouth guard, the walkout was great. Everything that had gone wrong leading up to the fight before was flawless. But I got hit once, and that was it. The world swayed. Herb Dean, the same referee who called my fight in Australia, jumped in, this time quickly. It was the end of the fight and my UFC career. I don't remember anything in the cage except that I never left my feet. I didn't want the fight to end. I was certain that I could still fight, but I have to admit that hours later I was still out of it. My brain was done fighting. I was done fighting. I was ushered out of the cage, no less devastated than a year before, but slightly more aware of the moment. We passed through a black curtain into a cement fluorescent lit corridor with floors lined by taped down electrical cables. The space was filled with the frenetic motion of a UFC pay-per-view fight night. Intimidating security staff checking credentials, black-clad cameramen and sound guys running back and forth. Men and women in their 30s, clad in business attire, talking into headsets and carrying clipboards. As I emerged, everything halted. Conversations stopped mid-sentence, heads lower and voices hushed like a funeral procession was passing through. We walked into the locker room, and I just stood there, sobbing. Travis held my hands. My mom wrapped her arm around me. My sister Maria standing next to her. My coaches, except Edmund, who was keeping his distance from my mom, lined the walls of the small space. Dana knocked on the door. "Is it okay if I come in?" he asked softly. I nodded. He gave me a hug, and I wrapped my arms around him, burying my face in his neck, ugly crying. "I'm done," I said. "That's it." "Well, at least you'll have a lot to write about in your next book," my mom said, attempting sympathetic reassurance. "There isn't going to be another book," I yelled into Dana's neck. For the first time since I had met him, Dana was quiet. He hugged me for another second, then turned and slipped out the door. I looked around the room. I just could not be there. I needed to leave. Now. "I want to go," I said. "Okay," Travis said, "then let's go." However, he swayed ever so slightly. "Go," my mom said. "I'll take care of anything that needs to be done tomorrow." We were led out of the arena, back the quarter mile to the MGM where Travis's supersized diesel truck, which he called Queen Elizabeth, the most powerful woman he could think of, was waiting for us at the door. We ran to the truck with nothing save but the clothes on our backs. Travis and I jumped in the back. Maria pulled the seat all the way forward. She looked like a child sitting at the massive steering wheel. The truck roared to life. My mom stood on the curb, watching as we drove off. The truck squealed as Maria turned the wheel. Travis held me as I cried. "Fuck this. Let's go have some babies," I said. He nodded. "Babe, I want nothing more than to have babies with you, but I don't want you to use them as a Band-Aid," he said. "Get yourself right first." By the time the post-fight press conference would have ended, the lights of the Vegas Strip had already receded from view. Halfway through the 4-hour drive home, Travis leaned over and asked Maria if she could stop at the upcoming In-N-Out. He ran in and came out bearing 2 bags of burgers, fries, and milkshakes. I ate, then fell asleep with Travis's arms wrapped around me. I didn't feel better or less empty or less emotion over the loss, but there was a finality that came from that fight. The first time I lost, I spent hours spiraling and second-guessing everything that had gone wrong. Maybe it was because I was really dehydrated from cutting weight and my brain didn't have the same fluid cushion. Maybe it was the mouth guard, the way it didn't line up with my lower jaw. Maybe it was the stress of the weight cut, the lack of an appropriate warm-up room, the family coach conflict, Travis's ex drama, the travel, knocking myself out and tearing my ACL, falling down the stairs, the media and the other exhaustion colliding. Maybe my brain just needed time to rest, and if I took enough time, I'd heal. Maybe. But this time, I had eliminated every possible distraction. I was rested and healthy. I felt fantastic all of camp. Everything had been perfect. And even then, the first time I got touched, I was out. That's how I knew I would never fight again. I just couldn't take the hits anymore. I didn't need to consult anyone or think it over. I just knew. I ushered MMA into a new era where it was understood that women not only deserved a spot on the fight card, but atop it. I wanted to be remembered for what I had accomplished in the sport, not as one of those fighters who didn't know when to say when. Losing was being shown the door. Losing was unspeakably hard. Walking away wasn't. For some people, their whole identity is tied up in being a fighter. My whole identity was tied up in being a champion. I couldn't be just a fighter that's in the mix. For me, there was nothing left to fight for. I remember reading about the Battle of Marathon, from which the race derives its name. The story of how a messenger ran 26.2 miles to deliver a message, then collapsed dead. I always wondered how someone could just push themselves until they fell over and died. I didn't wonder anymore. I had run my MMA marathon to the end, and that part of my life had just fallen over and died. About a month later, Dana called. "Hey, so you want to fight?" he asked. "Nunes, in Brazil, another shot at the title." I had to appreciate his optimism. "No, I'm really done," I told him. It was the first time I ever told him no when he called. 8. I find it fitting that experiencing loss is used to describe death. To me, that's what losing feels like. Like an overwhelming grief that shakes you from sleep at 3 a.m, leaving you staring into the darkness. A loneliness that makes you feel all by yourself, even in a crowded room. A scar that fades but never fully disappears. A part of your soul has died. From the outside, it probably looked like I took the second loss better, but it was equally devastating. I just better knew what to expect. I let the numbness wash over me. I wasn't going to be an example of overcoming adversity for anyone. But I no longer wanted to be everything to everyone. I wanted to be nothing to no one. I wanted to disappear. My entire MMA career, I gave and I gave. I never said no. I pushed aside what I wanted. I had to return to fight again, not just for myself, but for everyone else to whom I felt so indebted. When I walked out of the octagon the final time, I knew I had given everything I had. I didn't owe anyone a fucking thing. As time went on and I started to find my way back to the land of the living and on the other side of mourning my loss, I realized how liberating not giving a fuck was. I was not, as headlines declared, hiding out from the world. I just didn't want to be around people. As hard as it may be to believe, given the fact that I spent so much time and effort trying to get millions of people to pay money to watch events where I was center stage, I don't like being the center of attention. I'm good at it, but it feeds off me. It made me a lot of money, but it's not my happy place. LA no longer felt like my happy place either. It's not a place where you can easily hide out if your name has ever been in the headlines. I found myself retreating more and more behind drawn blinds, but even then I couldn't escape. A few weeks after the Nunes fight, photos of me standing in my bathrobe barefoot at my kitchen door feeding my dog on the back porch, taken over my 8-foot fence with a telephoto lens, were splashed across the internet. I had always been under the impression that there was a line that couldn't be crossed, that as long as I stayed within the confines of my property line, if I literally did not step foot outside of the house, I would be left alone. I was wrong. As a champion, I felt like anyone who stopped me to ask for a picture was a person that I had to be there for, that in exchange for my good fortune, I owed them. Now, it felt like everyone who stared at or approached me was rubbernecking at the train wreck of my life. Even when I ran into a genuine fan who wanted nothing more than to just say hi, they would say something like, "I was so devastated when you lost." Well-intended comments that were constant reminders of how I let so many people down. There was no just don't think about it because the world around me wouldn't forget. A few weeks after my fight, Travis and I took a road trip. I was in desperate need for a change of scenery. No one was expecting us in the small rural towns we passed through. We didn't even know where we were going to stop along the way. We had checked into a 2-star motel just off the interstate for the night after driving all day. Flipping channels, we landed on Tosh.0 as we lay in bed. I cuddled into the nook of Travis's arm, my happy place, watching as Daniel Tosh offered witty commentary on videos pulled from the web. "That was more depressing than a Ronda Rousey comeback," he quipped. The studio audience didn't even laugh. They groaned. I turned off the TV and cried on Trav's chest. I was literally a fucking joke now. One that didn't even land with the audience. And I couldn't get away, not even in the middle of nowhere. The sting started to dull after a while. Then it calloused over with resentment. I resented the fans. I resented the media. I was determined to outweight my infamy. And in a way, it worked. The news cycles ran on without me. I gave them nothing new to talk about. Travis and I already spent every day together, but we officially moved in together when I left Venice and we bought a place in Riverside, 70 miles outside of LA. Well beyond the boundaries of his 30-mile zone of stationed paparazzi. Travis's first ex-wife, with whom we shared custody of the boys, had remarried and moved there, so we got a place almost walking distance from her new house so the boys could move freely between our homes. Travis had started fighting to support his sons, but I could tell it pained him spending months away from them training for fights. We decided to retire and be full-time parents for the boys together while they went through some of their most formative years. I never pursued fame as a goal. It was a tool I leveraged to make my goals happen. And fame wasn't something that just happened to me. I worked for it. Coming up in MMA, I did every single interview, took every opportunity, every big commercial deal, every magazine cover, every red carpet possible. It didn't matter if it was in the middle of training camp. I did absolutely all of it. To be the fighting people's champion and hopefully the next big action hero, I had to hustle my ass off every day. I made sure my face was constantly plastered everywhere to the point it was almost impossible to escape. I had benefited from fame, but I fucking hated it. The stress of being under constant scrutiny for every word I said and angle I was filmed from every second of the day was crushing me. I was constantly being snuck in a back door, kept in a private room. It was isolating even when I wasn't alone. I wanted to do normal things with my family, to stand in line without being asked for a photo, to go to a public bathroom without feeling like I was walking a red carpet, to be able to just exist in the world and not be on display in it. I couldn't just turn off the frenzy I created around myself, so instead, I wore it down by dropping out of the public eye altogether, and to an extent, it worked. A week after we closed on the house in Riverside, under a waterfall in New Zealand, Travis asked me to marry him. I accepted before he could even fully get the words out. I didn't realize it at the time, but losing set me on a path to happiness. It forced me to step back, to reassess and reprioritize, to ask myself, what do I want to do? For the first time in a long time, I was presented with a question where I didn't have a rehearsed, witty reply. Failure forced me to realize I was living my life not for me, but as a fuck you to anyone who ever doubted me. Spite had been such a huge motivator for me in the beginning, and I accomplished so much because of it, but it had begun to fester. I became so obsessed with proving my doubters and detractors wrong that I was doing things I didn't even want to do just to show them how successful and happy I was, to make it so they couldn't escape my face. When I lost, knowing the pleasure those people derived from my failure consumed me more than the failures themselves. One day, after venting my frustrations, Trav looked me directly in the eye and told me, fuck them. They don't deserve a second thought. Living life out of spite to them is still allowing them to dictate your life. He was right. I decided it was time to change and picked up a shovel. I set to work making the house in Riverside, a small 2.4-acre farm built in 1979 and in desperate need of updating that we affectionately called Rousey Acres, into a home, and trying to figure out what I was going to do with my life now that I wasn't a fighter. For so long, my life revolved around pursuing perfection. Now, I wanted to spend it pursuing happiness. I started with a garden. Well, actually, I started by smoking a lot of weed, playing a lot of video games, and ordering a lot of food delivery, then moved into gardening. Emboldened by shows about life off the grid, gardening seemed like the perfect entry point when it came to self-sufficiency skills that would allow me to exit society entirely. Plus, it was something I could do without having to leave the yard. Yard being a euphemistic description of the concrete-bordered dry dirt squares in the front of our farmhouse. According to the internet, the first step was working the dirt. I found an old hoe in the barn, bought some seeds off Amazon, and went to work. Like an amateur, took my hoe out in the midday afternoon, 90-plus degree heat, and hacked at the ground for hours. Following a week's worth of labor and some time and labor-saving suggestions from the local nursery, I got to the point where I could plant some seeds. I walked around the house and grabbed the hose, pulling it behind me, ready to get this garden growing. In a scene straight out of a silent comedy, I found that the hose was 10 feet too short to reach my seeds. I dug through the garage until I found 2 old watering cans. I drizzled each little seed plot with water. Against all odds, one bud began to emerge. I was elated. The next morning, it was gone, eaten by a squirrel before it had ever had a chance. Undeterred, every morning before the sun started fully baking, I put on my large straw hat and gloves, grabbed my watering can, and set back out to tend my non-existent garden. Then it happened. I saw a single seedling had sprouted from where I had planted dozens of sunflowers. "Hey there, little guy," I said lovingly. This time, I was ready. I built a makeshift fence around the tiny plant. I fortified the fence as the flower grew. The lone result of a month's worth of work tilling the dirt and 17 packets of seeds, there it stood, surrounded by the floral equivalent of Fort Knox. It would have been easy to view my entry into gardening as unsuccessful, given the hard work and time I had put in, not to mention a lack of sufficient water. But as my little flower climbed toward the sky, I viewed it as a testament to what was possible. It was the first time that I didn't focus on where I had failed, but where I had succeeded. All the failed seeds didn't matter if even just one grew. Not only that, but I had to recognize that sometimes the speed of progress is beyond your control. I was being forced to stop and smell the sunflower. Not long after, Trav surprised me with 4 little chicks in what began our regenerative ranching journey. 2 days later, our brood was reduced to 3 when a hawk swooped down and stole little Moa right in front of me as I ate breakfast. "Moa!" I tearfully cried out toward the sky as the hawk flapped away, my helpless chicks struggling in its talons. We built a little fortress around their hen house, then added ducks to our flock. The more the farm grew, the happier I became. I started to discover the difference between outward validation and things that were validating in themselves. I was so much happier scrubbing algae from the walls of our duck pond with no one to appreciate it other than the ducks pushing each other to get to the water than I ever was being photographed, leaving a fancy restaurant to a crowd of people pushing each other to get my autograph. For my entire fighting career, I was living in a world that was go, go, go. Life consisted of endorphin-fueled training or serotonin-loaded bucket list level shit. Jetting off to the Cannes Film Festival, promoting a movie I'm co-starring in with fucking Rocky himself, flying in an F-16 with the U.S. Air Force Thunderbirds, surfing in Malibu with Red Hot Chili Peppers lead singer Anthony Kiedis, who mentions he's bringing his friend Ed, and Ed turns out to be actor Edward Norton, just to happen upon Surf Ledge and Laird Hamilton paddleboarding by. I was having unforgettable experiences that most people would remember their entire lives, but instead of enjoying it, I was ticking off boxes and not taking it in. I had just fought Kat Zingano in 2015 when I got a call from my agent Brad. Hey, do you want to do a spot at WrestleMania with The Rock? Which is how, a few weeks later, I found myself front row at WrestleMania 31 in San Francisco along with the other four horsewomen, Marina, Shayna, and Jessamine. We watched as Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson walked down the ramp to confront the WWE's authority. Triple H and Stephanie McMahon, real-world executives who also played fictionalized versions of themselves in the ring. We can create a WrestleMania moment right here, right now, The Rock said, launching into one of his trademark rhyming taunts. Triple H dismissed the idea. Stephanie, who despite being one of the nicest people I have ever met, played one of the best heels, or villain in pro wrestling terminologies, in WWE, sneered, slapped him in the face, and ordered him out of the ring, mockingly waving him off. The Rock turned, looking as if he was going to leave, walked out of the ring and circled around until he stood in front of me. A chant of my name started to circle around the stadium, like an audible version of the wave. 77,000 fans, the most in WrestleMania history, roared as my face appeared on the Jumbotron above the ring. The Rock and I exchanged looks of disdain for Steph and Triple H as if to say, we totally did not rehearse this, but fortunately, I happen to be here. If you want me to join you in kicking some ass, I'm in. The WWE relies a lot on exaggerated, unsaid looks. The Rock gestured to me to join him. As I jumped over the barricade, one thought went through my mind. Don't look stupid. The Rock and I did a few more, we gonna do this, yes, we're gonna do this glances. A fist bump later, we entered the ring. I stood in the ring with three of the biggest names in WWE history at its largest ever event, the crowd screaming my name. Steph, in full character, declared me the most dangerous unarmed woman on the planet, dominant in the octagon, but not in the ring. You need to understand something, Steph, I said, trying to act as if it was authentically happening in the moment, not the scripted down to the sentence work of WWE. Any ring I step into is mine. The crowd was locked in on us. The Rock took the mic, then lunged at Triple H, backing him up against the ropes in a series of choreographed blows and chopping him across the chest before throwing him my way for a hip toss. The crowd erupted. Steph came at me yelling, then raised her hand as if to slap me. When I grabbed her arm as if to rip it off, the crowd went wild. And that is the biggest WrestleMania moment of the night, The Rock had declared as Steph and Triple H retreated up the ramp. He wasn't the only one to think so. At the year-end Slammy Awards, never one to miss a chance at self-promotion, WWE had its own award show to give awards to itself. It was declared the This Is Awesome moment of the year. I wish I could say that stepping into the ring for the first time was a transformative moment, but honestly, it was one of those vague memories you only think about when someone brings it up. WrestleMania was still going on as I boarded the private flight that WWE had chartered so that I could get back to LA for training. My mind was only focused on, I've got my next fight coming up. And nothing mattered more than that. How was the WrestleMania thing? My mom asked that night on the phone, not really knowing what WrestleMania was, but just that it was a big deal. It was good, I said. Did you have fun? She asked. Sure, it wasn't a life-altering event or anything, but fun, I said. I shrugged. I mean, it's a cool thing that I got to do, but it's not like this is going to be my future. Now, nearly 2 years later, I had a newfound appreciation for living in the moment, but found I was having a hard time remembering things from one minute to the next. I'd forget countries I'd been to, events I attended, things I scheduled, where I had put my phone seemingly 1,000 times a day. I was starting to worry about the lasting effects decades of head trauma had left me with. Did I have CTE? Was I deteriorating? One of my greatest fears is to end up a shell of myself, old and broken in mind and body, unable to move or experience new things, unable to remember what I'd done. Every time I forgot something, I wanted to cry. Sometimes I would. You're getting in your head, Trav told me. You're not becoming more forgetful. You've always been like this, except before you just shrug and say, at least I'm cute, and move on. I did so many things not for the enjoyment they gave me at the time, but for the satisfaction of remembering I'd done them. But those memories were fleeting. I couldn't hoard them. I'd forget them. Collecting enviable experiences didn't equate to happiness the way I had hoped. The present was all I had. I found my phone for the 20th time in an hour, wiped my eyes, smoked a bowl, and went outside to check on my prized sunflower and chickens. Between that WrestleMania spot and my new life as an amnesiac horticulturalist, a few things happened in succession. Shayna left MMA behind for pro wrestling. Toward the end of her fight career, she'd started dabbling in wrestling just for fun. She made her first unofficial wrestling debut just a few weeks before her last UFC fight. Watching her train for the ring and hearing her talk about wrestling was like watching one of those romantic comedies where everyone else knows the main character is madly in love, even if they haven't realized it yet. When she told me she was going to pursue it as a career, the first word out of my mouth was, finally. She worked her way up the independent circuit, toured Japan, and was having the time of her life. I saw her happier in the ring than I ever had seen her in the octagon. She trained in LA at first with her mentor, former UFC fighter and pro wrestler Josh Barnett. But when it became clear that she had the potential to pursue wrestling as an actual career, she moved to Florida, the unofficial mecca of professional wrestling. Aspiring wrestlers flocked to Central Florida the way that Hollywood draws aspiring actors. Shayna had caught the attention of the WWE and was training out of their performance center, where the organization develops wrestlers through its NXT brand. Think of NXT as WWE's minor league system and the weekly Raw and SmackDown shows being the big leagues. Jessamine was also transitioning out of MMA and looking at pro wrestling as a possible next step. Marina, much to my delight, had ditched the loser boyfriend and fallen in love with Chris, an up-and-coming wrestler known in the ring as Roderick Strung, whom she'd met through the pro wrestling circle that was taking the place of MMA in all my best friends' lives. When she found out she was pregnant, she took the leap and moved with him to Florida. With my social circle now centering around pro wrestling, it was never far from my thoughts. Travis and I had set a wedding date for August. I looked ahead to our life together, to the family we were building with the boys, to a future that I hoped would, in the not-too-distant future, centered around the needs of a very tiny person. As I thought about the next phase of my life, I asked, is there anything I feel like I haven't done yet before I close this chapter? My favorite part of movie making was fight choreography. Acting was fun, but scripting fights was my passion. However, post my UFC losses, the movie offers stopped coming. I never aspired to be the next Meryl Streep. I died to be the next Bruce Lee. Pro wrestling provided an opportunity to do what I loved most about cinema, stunts. But where films can get away with telling the story, breaking for a fight scene, then coming back to the story, WWE offered almost the purest, most difficult way to use fight choreography as a form of storytelling. It was done in front of a live audience, sometimes improvised on the spot. After working on films where we rehearsed for weeks to shoot fights one beat at a time, the skill it took to perform an entire fight live while making every move believable from every angle blew my mind. Travis was right. In my heart, I am more than just a fighter. I am also an entertainer, a storyteller. This felt like the perfect way to combine them all. Once I considered the possibility of pro wrestling, I found that pursuing it was all I could think about. My style of fighting was always about following concepts, not memorizing techniques. I just had to learn how to use them to tell a story with a fight. I had spent so many years sacrificing any kind of enjoyment in the pursuit of perfection that it had been a long time since I'd been able to just have fun in the gym without this nagging feeling that I should be doing more. Since my WrestleMania appearance with The Rock, I'd done a little bit of wrestling training, but just playing around, not in the pursuit of a career. My friends had been doing it, so I tagged along. In the ring, I could just enjoy myself. I liked running the ropes. I liked taking bumps, the term for when you fall to the mat in wrestling. I just liked learning new shit, the challenge of how to create the most entertaining fight possible. I would lose track of time and train for 4 or 5 hours straight without even pushing myself, lost in trying to piece this new art form together in my mind. I didn't even feel tired. I still hadn't figured out what I was going to do with my life now that I had left UFC behind, but I was having so much fun learning to wrestle that it didn't matter. I asked Chris, Marina's soon-to-be husband, for names of people to train with in LA. He referred me to former WWE champion Brian Kendrick. He's good? I asked. We aren't really friends, Chris said, in a tone that alluded to some past disagreement without providing details. But if you're looking for someone to train with, I respect his knowledge so much that I'd highly recommend him anyway. It was the most backhanded, glowing referral I'd ever heard. Kendrick trained wrestlers out of a gym called Santino Brothers in LA's greater urban sprawl. The gym was in an industrial part of town in one of those neighborhoods that can elicit a raised eyebrow when you mention going there. It wasn't actually a gym, but a wrestling ring set up in a converted garage among a row of garages, each a different blue-collar business. To one side of Santino's was an auto repair shop. On the other, a paint shop. It was small and had a level of grime that can only come from a combination of nearby exhaust fumes, smoke, and the sweat of people grappling with each other in a poorly ventilated space. A substantial revenue generator for the gym came not from training aspiring wrestlers, but from producing custom matches. Custom matches are well known in the wrestling world, but less so to the general public. For a couple $100,000 a pop, depending on the talent, fans script out private matches. For some wrestlers, custom matches are almost a rite of passage. These types of matches are how a number of women in the industry make most of their money. It's a lot of scissoring the head, groin shots, and weird kinky shit. At Santino's, just like many other gyms, it was a standard part of the business model. We'd practice in the ring between shoots. On more than one occasion, the ring was a little damp. I never asked from what. In contrast to GFC, which had walls of windows, here, I didn't have to see anyone, nor could anyone see me. It was a perfect little hidey hole to get away from the world. We'd train, then smoke weed and hang around and shoot the shit. No one expected me to be this finely tuned athletic machine. It was like a lax sort of excellence. With no expectations, I found myself training with the focus and intensity I used to put into preparing for a title fight. I also found myself starting to wonder, what if? What if I wanted to do this as a career? What if I wanted to make a run at the WWE? What if it actually happened? I called my agent. Hey, Brad, I said casually. What's up? He asked. I had this idea. What if... I paused. If... Brad met my drawn-out question with one of his own. Okay, I said, restarting. You know, I'm getting married, and you know the girls are all in Florida. Marina just had a baby. I could envision Brad on the other end of the call waiting for me to get to the point. The words rushed out. So, I was thinking, instead of a bachelorette party, I wanted to do an R&B road trip with the girls, only since Marina can't come with the baby, what if we could all train together at the Performance Center for like a week before the road trip, you know, for fun? What do you think the WWE would think of that? Brad didn't even hesitate. They'd fucking love it. It hadn't been spoken aloud, but the WWE and I had been flirting. We were interested in each other. We knew there might be something there. We wanted to see where it might go, but neither of us wanted to say anything and scare the other one off in case the feeling wasn't mutual. Someone had to make the first move. The Performance Center, known among wrestlers as the PC, is a giant warehouse-type training facility. It's probably half the size of a football field, crammed with half a dozen wrestling rings. There's a weight room, cardio machines, and athletic training staff you'd expect from a sleek, state-of-the-art sports training facility. But it has the production resources and capabilities you'd expect from a film set. It smells like rubber, sweat, and hope. 70 or so NXT wrestlers train out of the PC at a given time. They come from all places and all backgrounds. Some wrestlers, like Shayna, have had success as a professional or college athlete before transitioning into sports entertainment. Others, like Marina's then fiancé, now husband, Chris, worked their way up wrestling's independent circuit to get their WWE shot. Wrestlers like Solo Sikoa come from legacy wrestling families, meaning they were literally born into this world. And there are wildcard stories like Liv Morgan. Liv, whose actual name, Gianna Daddio, is an even better in-ring than Liv, was a gorgeous former cheerleader working at Hooters when the trainer at her gym passed along her info to a WWE contact who set her up for a tryout despite her having no real wrestling background. Wrestlers range from near giants, the size of linebackers, and sumo wrestlers known for their power and strength, but who move with impressive agility for their size, to petite gymnasts who can do crazy flips off the top rope in every size and build in between. NXT was founded and under the control of Triple H, real name Paul Levesque. In addition to being my in-ring WrestleMania nemesis, he is arguably one of the best professional wrestlers in history and one of the better people on the business side. He is married to Stephanie McMahon, who is the daughter of WWE's Emperor Palpatine, Vince McMahon. Vince took over the company from his father in the early 1980s and spent the better part of 40 years playing a real-world pro wrestling version of Monopoly, buying up and absorbing smaller promotions until he basically owned them all. It's hard sometimes to know where the evil, unethical, slimeball character of Vince McMahon played out for the camera ends, and the actual questionably ethical, many times sued, and multiple times accused of sexual misconduct Vince McMahon begins. That blurred line between character and reality is a recurring theme within the WWE universe. But in both versions, Vince alone sits atop the WWE hierarchy. His two children, Steph and her older brother Shane, have both appeared as wrestlers in the ring, but Steph was more engaged on the actual corporate side. She was born into the business, but put in the effort to more than earn her place there. Together, she and Triple H were the heirs apparent of WWE. If NXT's ascent was any indicator, the future looked bright. It was creating an early fan base for up-and-coming talent and helping move female wrestlers further from eye candy to equals. WWE loves to do well-produced video segments about the legacy of women within the organization. But the truth is, women have largely been footnotes. For the longest time, they were relegated to serving male characters in a valet role, an overly sexualized supporting character that takes cheap shots when the ref isn't looking. Over time, as the level of female talent grew and society as a whole started to shift, the organization gradually expanded the role of female wrestlers. WWE bills itself as a sports entertainment organization, and just like in the mainstream entertainment industry, there was, by all accounts, a casting couch culture where men backstage in powerful positions pressured female talent for sexual favors in return for airtime. There were so many public accusations and scandals it's hard to keep track, and more that I'm sure the WWE managed to sweep under the ring. Women weren't just being demeaned backstage, but center stage. Up until 2007, bra and panties matches, where female wrestlers won the match by stripping their opponent down to her underwear, were an actual fucking thing. Even after that gimmick was retired by WWE executives, I'm sure very reluctantly and with a lot of lamenting about political correctness, it was still clear that the organization placed more value on a woman's physical appearance than her physical ability. The Divas era, with its pink rhinestone butterfly title belt, dawned around the same time. Women, while now portrayed as wrestlers, were still expected to look a certain way. Think lots of makeup, little clothing, and huge boobs. It would take almost another decade, years after I proved women could be a huge combat sports attraction, before women truly started getting time in the squared circle, what diehards call a pro wrestling ring. And it was only after WWE was basically armbarred into it, following a global social media backlash to #GiveDivasAChance, after divas were given a total of 30 seconds, less time than it takes most people to read this paragraph, for a nationally televised tag match. 4 women were given less time to collectively wrestle than every single man on the roster got for his intro music alone. Presented with this information, as a person outside of the wrestling world, you might draw the conclusion that there is a troubling, foundational, sexist, patriarchal culture within the WWE. You would be right. I have nothing but respect for the female wrestlers who paved the way for women wrestlers today, and nothing but disgust for the amount of sexist, degrading bullshit they were put through. NXT seemed to be making inroads into changing that. Sure, there were still a lot of pretty girls with enhanced tits among the mix of WWE hopefuls, but it was no longer a requirement. Not only that, but women were getting more opportunities to prove themselves as stars. It was a movement that Triple H was leading, and one that diverged greatly from what I heard about Vince's vision. Contrary to the catfighting that WWE loved to play out in storylines featuring its female wrestlers, there was a real sense of camaraderie among them, in part because professional wrestling isn't a competition but a team performance. Unlike MMA or judo, your success doesn't hinge on executing a move against the person on the mat with you, but doing it together. I liked that. In July 2017, the four horsewomen arrived at the home of the WWE's next generation. For the better part of a week, we trained nonstop. I was able to practice without the pressure of a tryout, but I knew that the WWE higher-ups were watching. Bumps, or falls, are made out to be this big deal in wrestling, whereas in judo, they're no big deal at all. We literally do falls as our warm-up. Marina and I jumped in the ring, taking falls to the canvas over and over like it was nothing. Afterward, Shayna, Jessamine, and I got in our rented RV and road tripped back to LA. We drove across the country along endless stretches of freeway, stopping at truck stop, gas stations, and middle-of-nowhere diners that started to feel vaguely familiar, until I was absolutely convinced I was retracing a route I had taken before. "Where are we?" I asked. "We just left Texas," Shayna said. "So I guess somewhere in New Mexico?" My mind flashed back like in a movie, where suddenly the pieces fall into place. The last time I had been on this stretch of road was when Travis and I had been driving out to Texas after my first UFC loss. I had been sitting in the passenger side of Travis's truck. Tears were streaming down my face. It was late November. It was cold and gray. I had been convinced my life was over. Now, less than 2 years later, I stared out at the same stretch of highway. The sun was so bright, it almost hurt my eyes. I had just had one of the most fun weeks of my life. I was surrounded by my friends. I was pretty sure I was on the verge of an incredible new career opportunity. I was about to marry the love of my life. My life was far from over. In so many ways, it was just beginning. Travis and I were married on a remote Hawaiian mountainside overlooking the ocean just before the sun set into the Pacific. As I walked barefoot down the grass path towards the man who would be my husband, the beaded train of my long white gown trailing behind me, I realized that everything I had been through, everything I had experienced, every loss, every disappointment, every heartbreak had been worth it because it had led me here. 9. Less than 2 weeks after our wedding, I kissed Trav goodbye and headed to Las Vegas. Shayna was in the finals of the first WWE Mae Young Classic, an all-women's professional wrestling tournament put on by NXT featuring its own up-and-coming talent as well as indie wrestlers not signed to the brand. Shayna had advanced to the finals, and I was committed to being ringside to see her live. It was one of the first times I was stepping back into a crowd since I had left MMA. It seemed somewhat fitting, considering that one of the first times I had left the house at all was to support Shayna at an indie show in a tiny gym, where Marina and I jumped out at the very end to help pull her out of the ring. Shayna had come a long way since then. As I braced myself to walk out into the crowd, I reminded myself, so had I. The fans cheered when they saw me. A chant of, "We want Ronda," went around the arena. It was a nice reminder that everybody in the world didn't hate my guts. Shayna went out and killed it. I could not have been happier for her as I watched her live her dream. I knew that if I made the jump to WWE, a lot of people would doubt that I had earned my place, but I also knew a lot of people would want to see me. A lot of people would doubt I had earned my place and would want to see me. The evolution of women in WWE had caught my attention, and I wanted to do what I could to help move that forward. In the UFC, I had proven that giving women a shot wasn't a charity case, but a business case. Getting the UFC to add a women's division felt like breaking down a locked door. In the WWE, women at least seemed to have a foot in the door. But despite all their skill and talent, they were still fighting to get the respect they deserved. I knew that I could use the spotlight that followed me and all that mixed emotion that people had toward me to help change how women in WWE were viewed. I had spent my entire MMA career focused on creating opportunities for myself, which also happened to blaze a trail for other girls to follow. Now, I had the opportunity to be part of consciously building something to benefit us all. Not only that, but I could do it with my friends. The four horsewomen together again, training with them at the PC, even for just those few days, reminded me of how much I missed our crew. We had converged in MMA, then gone on to our own orbits, getting married, having babies, starting new careers. And now, We had somehow all come back together in the world of WWE. At the Mae Young Classic, I could see all the pieces falling into place. It felt like pro wrestling wasn't as much a decision as it was a calling. I didn't choose WWE. It wasn't something that I trained on the indie circuit for years trying to do. It wasn't something that I set out to do. It was something that I just couldn't get away from. It was like the universe kept tapping me on the shoulder and being like, hey, pro wrestling. And I'd go, now's not the time. Now it felt like the universe was hitting me upside the head with a folding chair. By the time I left Vegas, I had made up my mind. I was going to go for it. A few months later, and a year since I had walked out of the UFC cage for the last time, I found myself sitting down across from Triple H to discuss getting into the WWE ring. My agent, Brad, sat to my right. We were in a private dining area at Republique, one of those fancy LA restaurants that I had never heard of, where entertainment industry folks were always doing dinners and asking you when you sat down, have you been here? With its central location, wall of windows, high glass ceiling, brick interior, and Gothic arches, it's not the kind of place you choose if you're hoping to slip in and out unnoticed by paparazzi. Considering how many times I met Triple H before, I was surprisingly nervous. You got this. I gave myself an internal pep talk. The server brought over a bottle of wine, poured a small amount in a glass, and handed it to me. I swirled it and took a sip. I nodded my approval. There was no way I was going to send it back like some kind of prima donna asshole. This part of the dinner, like the meeting itself, was just a formality. There was no point in pretending this meeting was about anything other than me joining the WWE. But what would that look like? My plan, as I laid it out, was to make a run in the WWE, not a career out of it. I would go from WrestleMania, WWE's equivalent of the Super Bowl in early April, to its Survivor Series pay-per-view in November. Pro wrestling is a skill that takes a lifetime to master, and I didn't have that kind of time. I figured I'd dip in, be a helpful accessory to the other women for a few months, and then dip out and start having babies. Up until this point, Triple H was sitting there, nodding. What about until April? He asked. WWE runs year-round on the creative side, he explained, setting up storylines and developing character arcs. They look at it as a whole season from one WrestleMania to the next. Would I be willing to commit to the entire year? I can do until April, I said, but I want to start by wrapping up my storyline with Steph before moving on to anything else. Triple H nodded in approval. Brad beamed. The server asked to take my plate. I had barely touched my food because I spent most of the time talking. I nodded and excused myself to go to the bathroom. Standing, I felt the world spin. I stood in front of the bathroom mirror, my face flushed, and did a little happy dance. Then straightened my posture, trying to look as serious and professional as possible. I started laughing. I walked back to the table, trying not to look like I was trying to steady my balance on a boat in choppy waters. I slid back into my seat and leaned over to Brad. We've got to go, I whispered. When I stood up, I just realized that I drank too much wine while sitting down. I can't be drunk in front of Triple H in our first business meeting. Wow, would you look at the time, Brad announced. I tried to say as little as possible amid the flurries of goodbyes, so excited, and we'll get you something this week. In the most obvious we were not here together moves that scream we were definitely here together moves, Triple H slipped out first. We waited a few minutes before Brad and I stood, and he guided me to the door where TMZ was waiting outside. I thought I just saw Triple H leaving, the cameraman said in a comment that was really a question. We were just hanging out, Brad interjected quickly. I just really enjoy fine dining, I said as Brad ushered me into the car. I ducked too late and slammed my head on the door. Fortunately, the camera missed it, but certainly wouldn't help the headache I was sure to wake up with in the morning. I didn't care. In that moment, the only thing I felt was elation. I was going to be in the WWE. By the end of the week, the contract had been drawn up. I was set to make my first appearance at the Royal Rumble, the WWE's annual kickoff event to build up to WrestleMania in Philadelphia less than 3 weeks later. I had one commitment that I had to fulfill before that could happen. So a few days later, I boarded a flight to Colombia to shoot Mile 22. Hollywood hadn't completely forsaken me since my loss, or at least the film's director, Pete Berg, hadn't. I was determined to prove him right for still believing in me as an actor. Now with the WWE deal in place, weeks of filming abroad was the perfect cover to deflect speculation that I would make a surprise appearance at the Rumble. The challenge was pulling it off. I made a point of posting a picture of myself on set to social media. An elaborate plan had been put in place to fly me from Bogota to Miami, then catch a private flight from Miami to Philly, where I would jump into a car with blacked out windows and be driven to the loading dock of a hotel. There, I would go through the back door and up the service elevator so that no one would know I was there. Everyone at every step was well versed in the need for secrecy. The day came, security knocked on my door in Bogota. I emerged, hat on, sunglasses on indoors, ready to go. We slipped out a back door to the waiting SUV. I shifted nervously on the ride to the airport. The first phase of the trip was the most exposed. The SUV slowed. I looked out the window, directly face to face with the airport greeter standing on the curb holding a large sign saying Ronda Rousey. The driver hadn't even unbuckled his seatbelt when I leapt out of the car, grabbing the sign from her hands. I crumpled the paper and threw it into the car as she blinked in disbelief. I looked around at the other passengers unloading and saying airport goodbyes. No one seemed to have noticed. I tipped my hat down farther over my face, pulled up my hood, and headed into the airport. I boarded the flight to Miami, kept my face to the window, and somehow landed undetected. From there, in a scene that could only have been interpreted as a cartel drug bust, I was led, head down, hat tipped, sunglasses on, hoodie up, surrounded by airport law enforcement, off a plane from Colombia to a waiting car on the tarmac. But it wasn't until the chartered flight from Miami touched down in Philly that it started to feel real. The morning of the Rumble, I was led through a series of cleared hotel hallways and service elevators to a car in an underground parking lot that drove me to a bus and then headed to the back entrance of the venue. For 6 hours, I waited on the bus, the anticipation building. I had received no guidance or direction on what was actually supposed to happen now that I was here. Suddenly, there was a knock on the door. I looked around, uncertain if I should answer it, when I heard the door open. "Can I come in?" a familiar voice asked. It was Colt, Rowdy Roddy Piper's son. His dad had been a WWE legend and my fight name namesake. When a mutual friend introduced us early in my MMA career, I had asked Roddy his permission to use the Rowdy name. "Sure, kid," he said. "No problem. Do the name proud." I promised to do my best. As I prepared to move into WWE, Roddy was never far from my mind. He had passed away suddenly from a heart attack at just 61 in 2015, and I dedicated my win over Betch in Brazil to him. Now, stepping into his world, I was more committed than ever to honoring him. With his family's blessing, I had modeled my first WWE shirt after his signature red and white tee. Now his son stood before me, smiling. "I wanted to give you something to wear for your debut," Colt said. This was my dad's. He was holding one of Roddy's trademark leather jackets. Colt helped me put it on. It was oversized, but perfect. "Can't wait to see you out there," Colt said. "Dad would be so proud." A little while after he left, there was another knock. Triple H's large frame filled the small doorway into the bus. He strode over to the table, picking up a pen and piece of paper, and started drawing. "This is the ring," he said, pointing to a box he'd sketched out. "This is the ramp," he said, pointing to lines off the box. "This is what we call hard cam side." He pointed off to one side of the ring. "This is where the cameras are. This is where the announcers' tables are. This is where the girls will be. Steph will be here." I watched as he gestured around the paper. "And here," he said, stopping as if indicating the X on a treasure map, "here is the sign." The sign being the WrestleMania sign. Ever since John Cena had pointed at the WrestleMania sign a decade earlier, it had become an iconic gesture. It says to the crowd that this moment is a key moment. "You're going to come down here, they'll walk into the ring, they'll be here," he said, pointing. They referred to the predetermined winner of the Rumble, Asuka, and the two current women's title holders, Charlotte Flair and Alexa Bliss, who she would have the right to challenge for a title shot at Mania as a result of her win. I nodded, waiting for him to go on, but he stopped. "Then what?" I asked. "What do I do? Do I do anything? Do I shake anybody's hand? What should I do?" Triple H shrugged as if I should know. "I don't know. Just feel it. Do whatever you want." I looked at him, then down at the paper to see if he had jotted down secret instructions I missed. Then back up at him, eyes wide. "Feel it?" I asked, incredulous, searching for more direction. The WWE had orchestrated a multinational effort under a level of secrecy typically reserved for military operations or jewel heists to get me there. He had literally drawn me a map, and in the end, I was being sent out there to just do whatever you want. Stand there, he said, completely confident. Take a minute to just register everything that is happening. Whatever you're feeling, let it show on your face, and then just do whatever you want. He paused, then added, just make sure you point at the sign. Triple H stood up and gestured that it was time to move. I followed him through the series of Super Mario-esque tunnels that run under every major sports arena to the backstage area that the WWE calls Gorilla. Inside, a monitor played the feed from the ring. Triple H, Shane McMahon, and Vince sat in the room as wrestlers entered and exited on cue. Asuka eliminated Nikki Bella, and the crowd went wild. Asuka pointed twice at the WrestleMania sign as Charlotte and Alexa entered the ring to see whose title she wanted to challenge for at WrestleMania. Gorilla is a space that marks the line between real and fantasy. You walk into Gorilla from a random arena hallway as yourself and emerge out of it a WWE superstar to a sea of thousands of cheering fans. Bouncing from foot to foot, I waited for my cue. Then, the opening riffs of Joan Jett's Bad Reputation blasted through the stadium. I stomped my feet, steeled myself, and then I heard it. A sound that I thought I would never hear again. It was the noise of an arena full of fans, cheering for me. I pushed my way through the thick black curtains that separated me from the world. I stood at the top of the ramp, taking a moment to take it all in. Then I stormed into the ring. The crowd went wild. I turned to the girls in the ring. I'll see you there. 10. With my in-ring debut set for WrestleMania, WWE put me through a gauntlet of medical tests like getting a house appraised before you buy it. I knew my body was beaten up, but it was my brain that I was worried about. I couldn't sleep the night before the MRI, terrified of what it might show. I was near tears when the docs not only cleared me, but also said that I had a pristine brain after looking at the scan. I never cried about losing my phone again. Officially cleared to make my debut, we had 6 weeks to build a narrative that people would care about enough to want to watch. The most obvious option, which is what WWE always opts for, was to leverage my previous WrestleMania confrontation with Steph and Triple H to set up a new dispute. Triple H and Steph, in their TV role as villainous WWE brass, not to be confused with their real-life role as non-villainous WWE brass, would face me and Kurt Angle, a former Olympic gold medalist turned pro wrestler, in a tag team match. For the better part of 2 months, the kayfabe, acting as if pro wrestling is not scripted and that everything going on is real, lead-up played out weekly on TV. At the Elimination Chamber pay-per-view, I threw Triple H through a table. In retaliation, Steph slapped me in the face. She told me beforehand she's known for having a hell of a slap. "Give me your best shot," I said. She wasn't wrong. When she connected, I saw stars. It immediately confirmed to me that I shouldn't be fighting anymore. I don't care how infamous her slap is. An open hand strike from a woman who's never fought in her life shouldn't stun a UFC champion. Disoriented, I tried my best to hide it and focus on the rest of the televised segment. Kurt demanded Steph and Triple H face us at WrestleMania. They tried to back out, only to find that through a shocking contractual technicality they had to take the match. And the stage was set. Behind the scenes, we were all working together to create a match that would go down in history. Weeks before WrestleMania, I was invited to the WWE warehouse to prepare. Pulling through an unsecured gate and up to the large white building that sits on the edge of a residential neighborhood and an industrial strip in a middle-class suburb in Connecticut, I was certain we were lost. What stood in front of me was nothing like the busy, state-of-the-art PC. It was literally a warehouse. I looked around the nearly empty parking lot for signage to indicate that this warehouse was the WWE warehouse, but found nothing. The GPS address indicated this was the place, so I walked up the ramp toward the gray metal door next to a set of loading docks. "Hello?" I said, pulling open the door, more than half expecting to step into a pro wrestling version of The Wizard of Oz where the new world is in Technicolor. What I found was just a warehouse. Concrete floors, large planks of wood, moving dollies, a small forklift, and rows of shelving stacked 20 feet high with cardboard boxes and plastic bins. The only immediate indicator that I might be in the right place was a large Saturday Nights, a WWE show defunct since the early 2000s, neon sign hanging from the ceiling. As I walked in, and there, to my right, tucked into a small corner of the massive warehouse, was a single wrestling ring in a room scarcely bigger than the ring itself. The walls around the ring were painted all black, a stark contrast to the otherwise gray floors, white walls, and exposed aluminum ductwork. Kurt, Steph, and Triple H were all there, as well as producer Sarah Amato, a former wrestler and the PC's first female trainer. Sarah was a driving force in NXT's shifting the portrayal of women from side piece to serious performer. Together, we spent hours standing around the ring talking through the match. First, the big picture version, and then how we'd tell the story through the action to get there. I didn't even have an established moveset yet. Someone would suggest a move, and we'd pause and try it out in the ring to see what it might look like. It was a collaborative back and forth. I felt empowered in a way that I hadn't before in my athletic career. In judo and MMA, training felt more like taking orders. Any attempt to give input during practice had been met with accusatory glares implying that I was only stalling for a few extra minutes of rest before getting back on the mat, or that I was too much of a know-it-all to do as I was told. But here, sitting among some of the best minds in the business, they were eager to hear what I thought. My suggestions were met with nodding, followed by, "And then what if we," or "let's try and see," and a gesture to jump into the ring and test out if it works. Triple H literally showed me how to tie my wrestling boots. It was surreal. I loved every second. During breaks in training, I wandered through the warehouse space. At first glance, it appears to be a regular industrial storage building, stacked with the various set pieces, rigging, signage, cables, crash pads, and broken down stages you might expect. Blue plastic bins, cardboard boxes with fragile stickers, and wooden crates with labels saying things like new ropes, breakaway glass, Hall of Fame podium, and banners, maybe, with names of pay-per-view events stretching back 20 years. But as you walk back through the building, it transforms into the WWE's 50,000 square foot grandma's attic, ending in the pro wrestling equivalent of the contents of the Louvre and every abandoned locker auctioned off on Storage Wars combined, with the movers being told, just put it wherever. A 5-foot banana yellow fiberglass Macho Man Randy Savage cowboy hat sits in front of a wall of Undertaker's caskets, stacked 7 caskets high and 6 caskets wide. Dozens of aluminum ladders wedged between the shelves that a life-size Andre the Giant cardboard cutout leans against. Boxes cover the floor. There are boxes stacked on tables, boxes stacked on boxes, boxes on scattered shelves, wedged in Jenga style, boxes set down in any open space that could fit a box. Inside them containing every pro wrestling artifact imaginable. Boxes taped shut, boxes with the flaps folded over, boxes completely open, overflowing with shirts of wrestlers long retired. White legal boxes with lids, neatly labeled to indicate its contents as decades worth of old, no longer published WWE magazine titles. Hard plastic boxes with lids, holding neatly organized manila file folders and black and white 8x10 photos. Boxes filled with unopened mail from Japan, postmarked 1995. Boxes of lanyards from a wrestling promotion WWE absorbed 2 decades prior. An oddly shaped box labeled gimmick guitars. Every surface, most of those surfaces being other boxes, is covered with the contents of what one can only assume also used to be in boxes. A still shrink-wrapped VHS tape featuring bikini-clad women called Tropical Pleasure WWF Divas. WWE used to be called WWF, until, in one of the many lawsuits involving Vince McMahon, they were sued by the World Wildlife Fund and lost. A copy of Wrestling World magazine from 1973 asking, "Does Bruno Sammartino want the NWA crown?" TV guides from the 1990s, Ziploc bags filled with yellowed newspaper clippings, a fake Puff Puff cigar still in its box, a red lunch cooler slapped with a Stone Cold sticker, a prop dagger with a straw taped to the back of it through which fake blood once must have spewed. The in-between spaces are filled with things too large to fit in boxes. Vespas, car bumpers, actual cars, more coffins, office chairs, crutches. oversized novelty checks dated 2008, and parts of bronze-painted papier-mâché statues. It is a jumble of near-priceless WWE history and shit your mom would have made you throw out ages ago. It's a work in progress. A voice behind me made me jump. I turned to see a guy in a t-shirt emerge from a small office. I nodded in agreement. So am I. In the lead up to WrestleMania, we spent weeks working to prepare. We spent more days at the warehouse and even more when we were apart. There was back and forth refining every detail. I was constantly working on my pro wrestling moveset. Two up-and-coming wrestlers from NXT, Lacey Evans and Dakota Kai, were both kind and brave enough to be my crash dummies as we developed moves like my finisher, the Piper's Pit. We met again at the Performance Center and got the input of Pro Wrestling Hall of Famers and legends, Shawn Michaels and Michael Hayes. This was in addition to Triple H and Kurt, who were also Hall of Famers. I watched masters of the craft gradually weave a masterpiece together. It seemed like tweaks and changes were always coming in, from moves to facials, wrestling speak for emotions shown toward the camera, down to miming pulling Steph's hair from my fingers. But I trusted the process. WWE had been doing this for decades, I told myself. The entire match was finalized a few days before I left for New Orleans, the site of WrestleMania 34. I flew in early, and for almost an entire week, the four of us rehearsed the match over and over until we had it down to the most minute muscle twitch. There was a learning curve, but it was more of a change than a challenge. My entire athletic career had been built around preparing split-second reactions for a near infinite number of possibilities. That each move could go multiple ways, and each of those moves could go multiple ways, and each of those moves could go multiple ways. I had to be ready and respond to every single one in a millisecond. Now, instead of needing to simultaneously solve a series of ever-changing complex algebra equations, I just had to follow a series of directions I'd read over 1,000 times. Pacing backstage in Gorilla, wearing a replica of Hot Rod's jacket with the words Rowdy emblazoned across my sports bra, I went through the choreography in my head. A leather-clad Triple H and Steph made an only at WrestleMania entrance complete with laser light show and biker motorcade. Vince pulled me aside. "Don't forget to smile," he said. "You have an amazing smile. The world smiles when you smile." I flashed my global grin-inducing smirk at him, then stepped up to the curtain. "See you out there," Kurt, wearing his trademark Star-Spangled Wrestling singlet, said to me. The "You Suck" chant Kurt had earned from a taunt to his theme song rose up through the stadium, punctuated by pyroblasts. Bad Reputation blared through the Superdome, and I walked out into the arena, excited to give the world a show. I emerged through a 10-story LED Mardi Gras mask and paused at the top of the ramp, once more taking it in. Just like they had in the UFC, people tuned in to watch my WrestleMania debut for one of two reasons. They were fans of mine and wanted to see me do well, or they were hoping to see me fail. Either way, they were watching. Instead of pushing through the crowd at a UFC fight, the stage was elevated just above the fans. Instead of amongst them, I was above them. The cheers were deafening. I stepped into the ring, taking off the leather jacket and Piper-inspired kilt. The kilt had been a late addition. In the weeks leading up to joining the WWE, I had tried a number of looks. Primarily skin-tight black bodysuits with various cutouts that undeniably looked cool but weren't really me. As I lay motionless in the MRI tube during my medical exam, listening to its whirs and clicks, it hit me. It should have a skirt! By the time the MRI tech pushed the button to slide me out from the machine, I had visualized the entire look that I now stood wearing. The rest of my WWE gear mirrored my UFC fight gear, just a sports bra and shorts. My padded fight gloves had been replaced by open leather gloves that covered my wrists and knuckles, modeled after my gauze fighting hand wraps. Ronda Rousey! Ronda Rousey! For the first time in my life, I didn't block out the cheers so I could focus. I let myself listen to the roar of the crowd. The ref called us to the center of the ring, and Steph took a cheap shot before he even said start. She is incredibly good at playing bad. The bell rang, but Kurt held me back. We wanted to make sure everyone knew, better than that. What we were really doing was building toward the hot tag. The crowd wanted to see me in the ring more than anything, so we were going to keep me out until their desire to see me reached a fever pitch. Kurt and Triple H started pummeling each other in the ring as the crowd chanted, "We want Ronda!" The two legends continued going back and forth. Kurt threw Triple H over his head. Fans cheered. As Triple H battled back, some of the most classic scenes in the pro wrestling playbook played out. Steph took cheap shot after cheap shot when the ref conveniently wasn't looking. Kurt was pinned, only to kick out at the last second. Kurt stretched out his arm to tag me in, our fingertips almost touching but just out of reach. Steph tried to help her husband by grabbing Kurt around the neck, but Kurt moved at the last second, resulting in Triple H almost hitting Steph. The close encounter was followed by a requisite over-exaggerated "whoa" expressions of shock on each of their faces. Kurt reached out again as if to tag me, but Steph pulled me off the apron. I smacked my face on the extended edge of the wrestling ring on the outside of the ropes and again out of his reach. Kurt threw Triple H from the ring. It was my turn to tag in. Our hands finally connecting. The crowd exploded. Shouts of "yes, yes, yes" surrounded me. I charged at Steph and ripped her through the ropes. I slammed her to the ground again and again. Then, just as I did before every judo and MMA match, I slapped my shoulders. I stomped my right foot, then my left. I backed her up against the rope, throwing rapid punches but making sure not to connect with a closed fist. I tossed her around the ring like a rag doll, exactly like we had practiced. I went for Steph and caught her in an armbar, but she poked me in the eye to escape. A heel move if there ever was one. In fact, it was Roddy Piper's signature. Steph kicked me, and I sold it as if I was in pain. In a move that had made me laugh every time we rehearsed it, Steph tapped her shoulders and stomped her feet, mocking my pre-fight ritual. I met her by grabbing her throat. I lifted her up on my shoulders, slamming her to the canvas. As the referee counted the pin, Triple H pulled the official off, then grabbed me by the leg, pulling me out of the ring. Kurt reemerged, and the two guys tried to put each other through the announcer's table before Triple H jumped into the ring, checking on his writhing wife. When Triple H turned back to the action, I stood before him, fists raised, gesturing, "Let's go." He brushed the protesting referee aside, and we met in the middle. Eventually, I backed Triple H into the corner with a couple jabs before unloading with both hands, fists closed. The crowd went wild. I turned to hit the ropes. He tried to cut me off with a kick to the stomach, but I caught it and tripped his supporting leg, somersaulted and stood, lifting the 6'4", 250-pound Triple H over my shoulders as if it were effortless. 78,133 fans, the biggest crowd in my life, lost their fucking minds. Steph jumped in again, pulled Triple H off my shoulders, then ran from the ring as I followed. Kurt threw Triple H around inside the ropes. Steph intervened to give Triple H the advantage, and finally I leapt into the ring to save the match. "This is awesome!" The highest praise that notoriously rough pro wrestling fans can give boomed through the Superdome. "This is awesome!" Triple H lifted me as if to throw me to the ground, which I reversed with a hurricanrana, a head scissors. I pulled him down and caught him in an armbar. The crowd jumped to his feet. He struggled to break free, about to tap, when Steph wrapped her arms around my neck, catching me in a rear naked choke. I fought to my feet. It was almost time to end this. I threw Steph to the ground. I grabbed her arm between my legs. At that exact moment, Kurt pulled Triple H into his signature ankle lock, a move Kurt had adopted from the first ever UFC WWE crossover star, Ken Shamrock. But just as we were about to put them away, Triple H launched Kurt into my direction, breaking my hold. We all four lay in the ring, not needing to feign exhaustion after 20 minutes of continuous action. I was out of breath, but I felt like I could do this forever. Steph and Triple H got to their feet, taking what looked to be an advantage over Kurt and me. Steph pulled me up for the pedigree, Triple H's signature move, that I had reversed on her husband moments earlier. I threw her over my head and rolled into an armbar. I grabbed her arm. "No!" she wailed. "No! Say you're sorry," I said in an unscripted moment. I was lost in the story. I couldn't help but being swept away in it. "I'm sorry," she screamed. "Too late!" I cranked just enough to make it look good, but not enough to pop her elbow from its socket like you'd tear away the leg of a roast chicken. She tapped dramatically. The fight hadn't been real, but the emotion was. The match would go down as one of the best tag matches in WrestleMania history and in the history of the company. It was an instant classic. Steph gave me a hug backstage. "That was amazing," she said. "You're amazing." It had been weeks of preparation, but it had paid off. I had come into the industry worried that I might not be welcome, but WWE had rolled out the red carpet for me. Little did I know, they'd start to slowly retract it. 11. I went from the road to WrestleMania to a wrestler's life on the road. From the outside, professional wrestling isn't that hard to figure out. It's basically a live soap opera for dudes with lots of fight choreography. I'm not saying it's only for dudes, but it's definitely being scripted by dudes, for dudes. You have good guys and bad guys, good guys who turn bad and bad guys who turn good. I guess the message there is trust no one. As an actual wrestler, there's the unending and nowhere recorded list of etiquette that I was constantly unknowingly violating to the point that I was pretty sure people were just making stuff up to fuck with me at that point. There's a shit ton of terminology and vast amount of institutional knowledge that both publicly and behind the scenes shape how things are done. There are unwritten rules about everything from how hard or soft you shake someone's hand to wiping your feet on the apron when you enter the ring. WWE is a year-round operation. Wrestlers spend well over 200 days a year on the road traveling and performing. The organization operates 3 types of shows: pay-per-views, weekly broadcasts, and untelevised house shows. WrestleMania is WWE's flagship event, part of a series of 10 or so pay-per-view events that are so named because they used to cost $40 or $50 a pop to watch, but now can be accessed via a streaming service subscription. Pay-per-views are spectacles. Everything is magnified. The arena, the crowd, the lighting, the crew, the cameras, the level of security, the number of wrestlers, the length of the show, the catering spread, the signs backstage pointing you in 100 different directions. Wrestling fans mark their calendars by pay-per-view dates. Royal Rumble, where 30 people fight it out in the ring at once. WrestleMania, Money in the Bank, where wrestlers fight it out to grab a suitcase suspended 20 feet in the air that can be cashed in at any time for a title shot. SummerSlam, the biggest event of the year after WrestleMania. Hell in a Cell, where a giant chain-link cage is put over the ring to both be used to climb and jump off of, as well as prevent escape. And a half dozen other events with names like Survivor Series, Elimination Chamber, and Crown Jewel. They're held in major cities like New York, Los Angeles, and Philadelphia, as well as now twice a year in Saudi Arabia. A nation that restricts the rights of women in a way I'm certain Vince McMahon wishes he could. To build up to those events, WWE produces 2 live televised shows per week, Monday Night Raw and SmackDown, currently on Fridays. Each of these shows is considered its own brand, and at least once a year, WWE reshuffles the rosters. These shows cycle through large to mid-sized cities like Milwaukee, Memphis, Portland, and Pittsburgh. The weekly broadcasts are a combination of scripted storytelling done through backstage segments, which are largely pre-taped but occasionally live, as well as in-ring promos and wrestling segments. Finally, there are house shows, or live shows. Unlike the multi-million-dollar spectacle of pay-per-views and the ever-churning hype machines of Raw and SmackDown, live events are a throwback to the independent circuit days. It's a scaled-down crew responsible for a scaled-down setup, not much more than a couple of jumbo screens, a few sets of lights, and a ring. Multiple live shows take place almost every week of the year, wedged between the SmackDown and Raw tapings. They occasionally pass through New York City or Miami, but they're mostly in places that few people outside of those towns could find on a map, like Monroe, Louisiana, Peoria, Illinois, Bangor, Maine, and Laval, Quebec. I was unaware of live shows' existence before I found myself regularly performing in them, but they quickly became my favorite stage. They feel like the 21st century version of the old-timey circus, where you roll into a small town and everyone excitedly comes out to watch the performance. They're not about reading overly dramatic promos, overly produced, constantly changing segments, or the glam of hair and makeup. They're just about going out, doing cool shit in the ring, and interacting with the crowd. For the next year, my life was a never-ending cycle of live shows, TV shows, and pay-per-views. Hello, and thank you for choosing to fly with us, the flight attendant voice announced over the intercom. This flight is heading to McAllen, Texas. If that's not your final destination, please let us know. Well, my ticket scanned in, so that must be right, I thought to myself. Honestly, it had gotten to a point where I had no idea where I was going beyond the gate number on my ticket. I had long ago stopped trying to keep track of the cities or dates. Occasionally, I was home long enough to swap out the clothes in my suitcase before kissing my husband goodbye and heading back out the door. Now, I was coming off a live show tour in the Southeast, followed by a Raw in New Orleans and a trip to Orlando to train at the PC for a couple days, before flying out to Houston to catch a flight that was apparently heading to McAllen. 2 rows behind me, I recognized 2 other wrestlers, setting my mind at ease. The tiny plane landed, emptying into a 6-gate concourse with nothing more than a coffee zone and an airport gift shop. I could hear the crowd before I could see the terminal exit. "Ronda! Ronda!" my name echoed, punctuated by cell phone camera flashes. I smiled apologetically and kept walking. In the beginning of my MMA career, when I never said no, I shook every hand, took every picture, signed every autograph. But in the end, I was always disappointing someone. There was always one more selfie to take, one more thing to sign, so I reached a point where I just kept walking. As we approached the "No passengers beyond this point" sign separating us from the crowd, I ducked behind a 6'4" former college football player turned wrestler who went by Mojo. "I'm just going to use you to block me," I said. I was taken to the tiny office where people file complaints about lost luggage. My sister Maria, who traveled with me sometimes, and I stood waiting in the small window-walled room as people stared through the glass. I felt like a zoo animal on exhibit. "It's not usually like this," the police officer helping with crowd control said, half apologetic, half surprised. "People have been waiting for over 4 hours." I shrugged. "It's always like this." We pulled out of the airport, and I looked to see how far it was to the closest Cracker Barrel. The Americana-themed diner, serving 24-hour breakfast with its cluttered country market selling everything from fudge, biscuit mix, and 25 flavors of glass-bottled soda to knit shawls and wooden signs painted with words like "Blessed and Live, Love, Lake." Cracker Barrel had become a staple of my life on the road. It's not fancy, but it's reliable. Sometimes there's just something comforting about knowing what you're going to get. 2 wrestlers, known to the world as Elias and Finn Balor, were waiting to pay their bill as we walked in. Away from the makeup and hair gel and pleather pants, it can be hard to identify individuals from their in-ring personas. But even in street clothes, they have a certain look. Tall, fit, well moisturized. "Imagine running into you here," I said, overly dramatic. "Yeah, me and Ferg just stopped to get some breakfast," Elias said, using Finn's real name. "You know the drill, just trying to kill time." The waitress held up menus to signal she was ready to seat us. After my standard breakfast of 2 eggs over easy, turkey sausage patties, and toast, we tried to kill time before the arena opened its doors for rehearsal. When you're trying to fill the hours between an 11 a.m. hotel checkout and a 4 p.m. call time, the clock seems to slow. We stopped at a Target where I took a picture of myself wearing a hot dog costume and texted Triple H thinking of changing my walkout look. He vetoed the idea. We sat in the parking lot playing board games until the doors opened. Based on my singular experience, I had been led to believe that the preparation we'd put into our WrestleMania match was the WWE model. Not only that, but in our first meeting, Triple H said that they structure storylines all year around building toward a finale at WrestleMania. Nothing could be further from the truth. The WWE model actually was no preparation, and there was no creative or producer input. Instead, wrestlers were expected to come up with a match on their own in the days leading up to an event, if they even had that luxury, using live shows as a way to flesh it out and rehearse. And then, day of the event, an edict would come down from the top that everything was going to change. I had requested to face Nia Jax as my first WWE title run storyline. At 6 feet, 270 pounds, Nia, whose cousin is The Rock, was an opponent I could believably battle it out with, leveraging my athleticism and her size to create incredible matches. However, going into Money in the Bank, my first pay-per-view following WrestleMania, I was informed that my pairing with Nia would be a one-off to set me up for a rivalry with Alexa Bliss. The word had trickled down from Vince to Triple H to the producers to me. Huh? I did a double take. "It's a good thing," the producer told me. "Alexa's the biggest star." "Alexa is 90 pounds. She is the exact opposite of big," I said. "She is tiny." "She sells the most merch." As the producer spoke, I heard the words in Vince McMahon's gravelly voice. "Okay, if that's what they want," I said, trying to work through the logic. "It's part of the process," I told myself. "They're putting me up against Alexa because they want to test me. They want to see if I can sell well enough to convince everyone that this little 5-foot, 90-pound chick with blonde pigtails could actually hang in a match with me. This is going to make me better." but it became clear I was trying to rationalize completely irrational decisions. Making me better never factored into the thought process. It was about finding a way to thrust me into the cogs of a system, one built on accepting that everything must be last minute because we're all beholden to one nearly 80-year-old man. Coming into WWE, I hadn't imagined that I would do a singles match all year, let alone as my second match. I begged for some time to rehearse, and Nia was kind enough to travel to Browsy Acres for a couple days so we could put together some of the match in the ring that WWE had loaned me. We didn't have the best minds in the business working with us to make it great. It was just me and Nia in my backyard, and a producer to consult with the day of the event. It was a big test, even more difficult than Mania, but we managed to pull out a decent match. Just as it seemed I had Nia dead to rights in an armbar, Alexa crashed our match, striking me in the back with a metal suitcase she had won 4 matches earlier. Inside, it contained a contract, which gave her the right to challenge Nia right then, right there. Alexa stole my win and, in defeating Nia seconds later, took the title for herself. At SummerSlam, the next major event on the WWE calendar, I claimed what was rightfully mine with a vengeance, submitting Alexa with an armbar and became the first woman to have both a UFC title and WWE title. SummerSlam was a short match, with even less rehearsal and help than before. I could feel the resentment from the fans over my being handed the title so quickly. I had not set out to be a WWE champion. In fact, I had asked to not have the title for my entire run. My idol, Roddy Piper, had gone his entire Hall of Fame career without a belt. He didn't need it. Neither did I. But my merch was already selling well, and Vince believed elevating me to the champion would provide an even bigger boost. Merch sales seemed to mean more to him than the product itself. Now I had to defend it at Hell in a Cell, where, contrary to the name, we would not be fighting in a cage. This lead-up series of Friday and Saturday live shows in smaller Texas towns was so Alexa and I could put together our match for Sunday's pay-per-view. Where I had previously spent 2 months preparing for WrestleMania, we now had 2 days to stage Hell in a Cell. I found Alexa in the women's locker room, and we headed out to the ring. A handful of other wrestlers were already there. We shared the crowded space, focused on our choreography, but with a subconscious awareness that at any moment someone might come flying off the rope behind us. "Doors open in 90 minutes, an event staffer announced. That meant rehearsals would end soon. We put together and memorized a sequence of 80-some moves. For all its scripted brutality to give the appearance of a chaotic fight, pro wrestling is really an intricate choreography. It has to be executed flawlessly. One tiny fuck-up and someone could be significantly hurt. Precision takes time to perfect. Time is one of the many things WWE does not provide its wrestlers. "Doors open in 5, a voice echoed around the empty arena. We needed to clear the ring. Lexi, Alexa's actual name, and I headed backstage, still talking and walking through the match. While she got ready, I paced the dimly lit hallway, moving through the match in my mind until I could see it playing out, even with my eyes closed. "I know we're in Texas, but what's the name of the city tonight?" I asked right before we were set to go out. Edinburgh? Edinburgh, a gray-haired man in a security jacket with a slight southern drawl informed me. "Hey, at least I know the state," I said in my defense. He looked at me unimpressed. I wanted to explain that the month before I had yelled to the crowd, "Thank you, Ohio," only to be told, "You're in Michigan." But bad reputation started up and out I went. The match went well, but not perfect. The crowd seemed to enjoy it, but live show crowds were a lot easier to please. Even with less time to prepare, I felt like I was light years ahead of where I had been for my WrestleMania debut. I was able to remember more and more complex choreography in less and less time. Despite the unbelievability of our matchup, Alexa was a joy to work with and taught me so much about relying on emotion, creating moments and comedy in addition to my intensity and athletic prowess. My matches weren't getting better, but at least I was. "Are you heading out tonight?" the WWE security asked as we walked out of the arena to the parking lot. It was just under 150 miles to the next stop in Corpus Christi. Wrestlers fall into 2 camps on the road: those who prefer to head out to the next stop directly from the show, and those who spend the night and head out in the morning. I was in the late night camp, still coming down off the adrenaline rush of performing. "There's flash flood warnings," he cautioned. "Avoid the route along the coast." It was after 3 a.m. when we pulled up to the Holiday Inn. Rain was coming down in sheets. There were buckets in the lobby collecting water dripping through a leak. The carpet squished under our feet as we dragged ourselves to the check-in counter. The next morning, I made my way down to the tiny workout room. My back ached. A fracture in my spine, first discovered in my initial WWE medical evaluation, combined with taking bumps every week, wasn't doing it any favors. Neither was the rain. I was hoping a half hour on the elliptical might loosen it up before heading to the venue. I looked around the small beige space. A rack of dumbbells was against one mirrored wall, cardio equipment facing another. A few weeks prior, in a nearly indistinguishable 2.5-star hotel gym, I had run into Wyndham Rotunda, better known as Bray Wyatt. We made small talk, and the space slowly cleared. My workout ended, and I climbed off the machine. He leaned toward me. "Just so you know, these people aren't your friends," he said. "No matter how nice they are, no matter what they say or how they act, we're always just going to be pieces of meat to them. Get in, make your money, and get out." "Thanks," I said. "Appreciate the honesty." It was the first time someone said aloud what I had started feeling. Before joining WWE, I understood it was a business, but I had been under the impression it was run more like a multi-billion-dollar sports franchise or a major entertainment studio than like a two-bit circus run by a bunch of carnies. It's fitting that the WWE prides itself on its social media presence and 1 billion combined followers because its elite, big-budget organizational image is about as real as an Instagram filter. WWE calls its wrestlers superstars to the world. To the IRS, it calls us independent contractors. This distinction lets them off the hook when it comes to providing benefits like health insurance coverage or sick leave to the athletes that it expects to regularly launch themselves off ladders and through tables. WWE will be quick to point out it covers in-ring injuries, meaning medical bankruptcy is something you don't have to worry about when they ask you to jump off the top of a 20-foot metal cage onto a guy standing 2 stories below. But when it comes to the daily wear and tear injuries that plague the vast majority of wrestlers, you're on your own. It is worth noting, WWE isn't completely soulless when it comes to helping out its talent with non-emergency medical procedures, as WWE will cover all boob jobs at 100%. Being an independent contractor also means that wrestlers are responsible for paying their own travel costs as they are ping-ponged around the country. International trips are an exception. The organization also covers stays at the designated TV hotels for the Big 5 events: Royal Rumble, WrestleMania, Money in the Bank, SummerSlam, and Survivor Series. But only because it's easier when it comes to logistical and security concerns. Otherwise, WWE assists flying wrestlers into the first city and out of the last, but everything in between is on the individual's dime. With the exception of a handful of wrestlers with bigger name, bigger contracts, and more clout, myself included, who are able to negotiate travel expenses into their contract, the overwhelming majority of talent pays out of pocket for travel to over 100 different U.S. cities a year. Wrestlers frequently travel together in pairs or groups of 3, even 4, often sharing rooms at budget chain hotels with free to-go buffet breakfasts and carpooling to save as much on costs as they can. With the exception of its largest stars, WWE requires that all wrestlers be present for every pay-per-view and their brand-related show, whether or not there is any intention of using them. I watched as wrestlers on the roster came only to sit in catering week after week, unused on air. In Corpus Christi, I got ready in the makeshift women's locker room with the 3 other women on the live show tour. I paced back and forth, playing out the match in my head. It was the same one we'd done the night before. Wrestlers drifted in and out of the talent viewing area. 24 or so folding chairs, arranged in a semicircle around a TV, streaming an in-arena broadcast. Here, some of the biggest names in WWE sat around discussing things like kitchen remodels as they reheated their dinner in a lone microwave. They waited for their cue, upon which they instantly transformed from down-to-earth country guy flipping through photos on a smartphone to an angry giant flipping someone through a table. This is what life on the road is really like. Customized Speedos and baby-oiled bodies, chain restaurants and 3-star hotels, driving through the middle of nowhere in the dark of night. The next day in San Antonio, the site of Hell in a Cell, I stood in front of a mirror in full glam, a nearly unrecognizable version of my makeup-less self from the past few days. My hair was in intricate braids, a look I'd started building out with my hairdresser. Like my boots before, these were my battle braids. When the braids went in, that meant something was going down. Brad had negotiated a dressing room into my deal for the small team that traveled with me to TV tapings. The once move and be murdered vibe of my silent coach-filled locker room of the UFC had been replaced by a dressing room humming with an up to 7-person team's day of event activity. Typing, photo editing, filming, cleaning makeup brushes, punctuated by music, scented candles, and, in my biggest departure from my UFC days, laughter. I walked over to a corner of the room, moving through a one-sided version of the match, bobbing and kicking, clutching and ducking, in what probably looked like some kind of weird interpretive dance. Want to hear me go over it? I asked Trav, who had flown in the day before. Sure, he said. I walked him through, step by step, for the 10th time. We're going to come out, lock up, to the ropes, and then we're going to do the twisty-do. I'm going to come off the ropes and be like, oh no, and then it's going to be like, ouch, my ribs, and then she's going to come down like, at me, and then I'm going to throw her back, and I'm going to throw her up into the corner. I'll be like, oh, and she's going to be like, no, and I'm going to be like, yeah. I mimicked the motions of an armbar, a huge smile on my face. You're going to be great, babe, he offered. Backstage in Gorilla, I bounced back and forth on my toes. A sold-out AT&T arena full of 15,216 people jumped to their feet. No matter how many times I have walked down that ramp, it's still a moment that gives me goosebumps. Professional wrestling requires incredible skill and athleticism, but it's not a sport. It's not a real competition. You don't actually win titles. Vince McMahon decides that he's willing to let you play a part for a while in a scripted TV show. My experience as a professional athlete, not just a professional entertainer, helped me not to lose sight of reality while living in this fantasy land. But even conscious of it, there was a constant battle to not lose myself to the character. I wasn't alone. One night, during a live show tour in Japan over drinks, Wyndham shared a cautionary tale. In portraying Bray Wyatt, he had faked a Louisiana accent for so long, he couldn't even talk like he used to anymore. He lost that part of himself to the character he created. It wasn't long before I felt that pull too. The immersive nature of the world of WWE started to creep up on me. I wanted so badly to succeed in the business that I'd obsess over my character until I started to lose track of when I was thinking as a dramatized Rowdy or real-world Ronda. It's hard for anyone to stay grounded in a world where people are in character more than they're not. More people call you by your stage name than your actual name. For so many wrestlers, their identity is completely interwoven with this imaginary persona they've created. The line between real and not starts to blur until sometimes I wonder if anyone even knows where the line is anymore. WWE history is filled with examples of wrestlers sobbing backstage over losing a match for a made-up title, of real-life friendships strained by in-ring rivalries, of actual relationships destroyed by fictional storylines, of imaginary championship reigns going to people's heads. For so many wrestlers, this is a place where they command respect and have clout. It's where people recognize them. It's all they think they have. This is not a phenomenon unique to wrestling. I'd seen it in judo, I'd seen it in MMA, I'd seen it in Hollywood. Hell, I'd seen it as a bartender and in high school. These circles that you are led to believe are the whole entire world, and yet are completely insignificant to everyone outside them. You build your identity around your place in this tiny space, and without that thing outside of that realm, you are convinced you are nothing. But just like everything in WWE, it's not actually true. 14 hours after Hell in a Cell, including a 4-hour car ride to Dallas, I walked into yet another arena for Monday Night Raw. Every week, wrestlers are given a call time, usually 6 to 8 hours before the broadcast starts. Weekly shows are held in NBA or NHL arenas or the occasional smaller city minor league venue or event center. You walk through a metal door into a cold, concrete, fluorescent lit hallway indistinguishable from the city before. Sitting in chairs or standing next to doorways, event site security surrounds you in yellow jackets dotting the halls. The same white paper makeshift signs are taped throughout, large black arrows pointing you in various directions. Each features block text and an identifying icon. Catering with a knife, fork, and spoon. Doctor with a medical symbol. Gorilla with a gorilla. Writer's room with an equal parts aspirational and delusional bust of Shakespeare. Production meeting fittingly indicated by an empty conference table where no one is coming up with any kind of plan. Vince's office, in what seemed like a missed opportunity, is not designated by an inverted pentagram. The arena is filled with sounds of clanking metal, drilling, crates being wheeled in various directions, and the unfolding of hundreds of chairs. WWE production staff dressed in suits and wearing headsets roam the halls back and forth. Wrestlers trickle in. Giant men in hoodies and sweatpants unfold themselves from behind the wheel of compact rental sedans. Fit women in oversized sunglasses, dressed in tight outfits to adhere to guidelines requiring women to arrive looking sexy, pull small rolling suitcases behind them. Everyone walks with the slowness of a constantly aching body toward the arena. We greet each other in the halls, playing out various exchanges of the same conversation. Do you know what you're doing? Followed by mutual hysterical laughter. I bumped into Liv Morgan rushing down the hall. It's going to be great tonight, she said with a sarcastic smile. The official rationale WWE gives for requiring everyone to be on hand for every event is that injuries can occur, and having all talent there makes it possible to swap someone in if necessary. The truth is, WWE wants everyone there because they don't have a fucking clue what they are actually doing until the last minute. While claiming to be the longest and second longest weekly episodic programs in the United States, based on the number of shows they've done, not the actual length of time they've been on air, across its Raw and SmackDown shows, one would think that WWE has had plenty of time to figure out how to plan out a show more than a few hours before the broadcast is set to go live. You would be wrong. Wait, what's happening? I asked. I had been told I was shooting a promo, but now, according to Liv, a decision from the top had been made for me to issue an open challenge, taking anyone right here, right now. A producer knocked on my dressing room door. Did you hear the change of plans? My face indicated that I had. There were never actually plans, just changes in plans. I was aware WWE was scripted, but I could not have imagined that those scripts, in some cases full-page monologues, would be delivered on the day of taping, only to be replaced 3 or 4 times over the course of a few hours, single-word changes highlighted in yellow, in an ongoing series of completely unnecessary tweaks that Vince wants. If you deviated from a hastily changed word or two, you'd hear about it later. Perhaps the biggest kayfabe is that WWE is actually run like a functioning company and is not the absolute fiefdom of one man. Nothing gets done at WWE without Vince's approval. Storylines are scrapped at the last minute on his whim, sending writers and segment producers scrambling to come up with something new. Outcomes of matches are changed at the last second, sometimes during the match itself. Segments are cut, monologues are rewritten, and everyone just accepts it with a shrug. Everyone is getting updates before I do, I told the producer. We'll find a better process, he assured me. Now, about rehearsal times. Rehearsal times? I asked. The schedule for the ring. I was incredulous. There's a schedule for rehearsals? It had been over 6 months, and this was the first I was hearing of a schedule. I thought everyone just kind of showed up, I said. No one had ever mentioned a schedule. Where do I find it? Is it written down somewhere? Not really, he said. I looked at him, waiting for him to either finish that sentence or realize how ridiculous that sounded. I headed down the hall, turning left into the women's locker room, a space that, a few months earlier, I had been nervous to even enter. I worried that they wouldn't feel like I had earned it. Hell, I probably would have felt that way myself. But the other girls, with minor exceptions, could not have been more welcoming to me as I crossed over into their world. Given the traveling carnival nature of WWE, the women's locker room referred more to a collective of the organization's female wrestlers than it did any kind of physical backstage space where a female talent sign might be slapped up on a given day. We were a unit, if not a complete utopia. It wasn't uncommon to see chicks bicker over someone not selling. In wrestling, selling refers to an appropriately dramatic reaction to make your opponent's moves look believable, or someone being too demanding. There were women who weren't even on speaking terms, but regardless, we'd all have a good time amongst the chaos. As Natty liked to say, we're a dysfunctional family, but we're still a family. That night, I faced off against the Riot Squad, a trio featuring A heavily tattooed Ruby Riott, Liv Morgan sticking out her trademark blue-dyed tongue, and Sarah Logan, 2 streaks of Viking-inspired face paint across her left eye. We had no time to rehearse the last-minute changes in the ring, so Sarah was calling moves to me on the fly. The problem is, I didn't know all the terminology yet. "Backbreaker!" she shouted under her breath. "What's a back? Ah!" I found out the hard way. Thankfully, the crowd could almost never tell how much we were struggling to keep up with the mayhem. If WWE were to be judged as a truly competitive sport, the best scoring system to apply would come from one of the most unlikely places: pairs figure skating. Wrestling isn't about brutality, but about flawlessly coordinating your movements in synchronicity, making sure everyone is hitting their mark, even if that means making on-the-fly adjustments. If the adjustments are on point, no one will ever know. After the show, I visited with Steph for a few minutes to catch up. I couldn't help but wonder at how different she was from her father. Fans were still trickling out when a crew of hard-hatted workers began deconstructing everything in the arena and hauling it out to semi-trucks plastered with the supersized faces of the wrestlers walking by. It was after midnight by the time we got back to the hotel. 3 hours later, I was in the lobby, leaving for the airport. It was still dark. I rested my head against the window as we drove. I had the upcoming weekend off. I could spend a few days feeding my chickens and hanging out with the goats and donkey that we had added to Browsy Acres before a black SUV rolled up my gravel driveway to take me to another plane. But next time would be different than all the other weeks that rolled into each other. I was very aware of where I'd be going next. WWE had announced its next big show 3 months prior, and it was going to be in Australia, in Melbourne, in the exact stadium where I had fought Holly Holm. 12. I had zero intention of ever returning to Melbourne. "It's fine," I kept repeating, mostly to myself, but also to everyone else who asked how I felt about making the return. "It's fine" sounded a lot better than the truth, which was that just the thought of returning to Melbourne filled me with dread. It had taken me a long time to move forward. I wasn't entirely sure I had it in me to go back. I squeezed Trav's hand tightly for the entire 15-and-a-half-hour flight. Tears slipped down my cheeks. So much had changed, I told myself. I had changed. It was going to be fine. I stepped out of the airport and into the WWE's bus taking us to the hotel. I stared out the window silently as Melbourne materialized to my left, the suburban sprawl giving away to the city skyline. It had been years, but it still felt familiar. This is where we went right, I thought. We turned right. "We're almost there," someone said. The bus slowed to a stop. I looked up and saw it. 28 floors of the Crown Metropole. We were at the same fucking hotel. The last time I had set foot in this hotel, I was Ronda Rousey, undefeated UFC champion. Then I wasn't. That hotel, that room, it was all part of the before. It was the room of a person who no longer existed, from a life that I would never be able to go back to. "We can book you somewhere else," a concerned-looking Triple H said after I mentioned having been to this exact hotel before. "It's fine," I muttered. We walked inside and were handed our keys. Travis took the paper sleeve with the room number printed neatly on the front. I squeezed his hand as we walked to the elevator. The elevator beeped as we passed each floor, going upward until it dinged at 24. The doors opened. We looked at the small sign on the wall indicating one set of room numbers to the left, another to the right. It looked oddly familiar. I stared down the long hallway and took a breath, following Trav. We got to the door and stopped. Travis opened the door and we both stood there for a moment, stunned. "You've got to be fucking kidding me," I said. I stared at the same white walls, the same orange carpet, the same view overlooking the river and the aquarium. It wasn't just a familiar room. It was the same fucking room. I burst out laughing. I had been telling myself and everyone around me it was fine. It seemed the universe wanted to make me prove it. In that moment, I resolved to do just that. to go out there and prove it to the universe and, as importantly, to myself. The last time I had been here, the worst thing that could have happened happened. Nothing I could think of was ever going to be as bad as that. The next afternoon, after the second time in my life, I stormed into what had been renamed Marvel Stadium to the sounds of Joan Jett and an announcer shouting, "Rowdy Ronda Rousey," to the roar of over 50,000 people. The Bella Twins and I defeated the Riot Squad, a match I won not just by armbar, but by my newly invented double armbar locking up both Liv Morgan and Sarah Logan at once for a simultaneous tap-out. The Bellas raised my arms in victory, my WWE title belt over my shoulder. I looked around the Melbourne Stadium, cheering my name, tears welling in my eyes. It felt like a weight had been lifted not just off my shoulders, but my soul. It wasn't redemption, but it was closure. A week after we got back from Australia, the Bellas turned on me to set up a headline match between Nikki and me for the WWE's upcoming all-women's pay-per-view, Evolution. I had joined the WWE to help move its women's division forward, but I was hesitant to be the face of that movement. I had no desire to be WWE's big star. Instead, I wanted to help create WWE's next star, like how Roddy Piper made Hulk Hogan. Hulk Hogan emerged as the first mainstream wrestling star in part because Roddy had made himself so hated by the fans that anyone who beat him became their hero. In the UFC, I had focused on my own legacy. I had opened the doors for women, but I built that division just for myself. My goal had been to walk away undefeated and take the title with me, leaving the girls to come forever in my shadow. In pro wrestling, the title isn't something to be taken with you. Your last match is always a loss, so the belt can be passed on. Leaving those who come next in your shadow serves no one but yourself. You lay your legacy down to serve as a step up for the women who follow you. When I came into WWE, it felt like we were in the middle of important changes. I don't know exactly why Triple H made elevating the women's division his mission. Maybe he wanted to create a more equitable world for his 3 daughters. Maybe he saw the business opportunity. Maybe it was to stick it to Vince. Maybe he just believed it was past time for women to have the same platform and opportunity as male wrestlers because it's the fucking 21st century. For whatever reason, Triple H was our biggest advocate. I was the superstar who was going to help take the women's division from the afterthought to center stage. In wrestling, they talk about putting someone over, meaning to make them look good, helping them win over the crowd. My goal was to help put the women's division over. We might have been rivals at WrestleMania, but on this front, Triple H and I were on the same team. He had sold me on the future of women in the industry. It was a vision that I believed in so strongly that I obsessed, worked, performed, and traveled more than ever before. Once WWE made me champion of the division, I felt responsible for it. My pro wrestling journey stopped being about just having fun and becoming about pushing the women's movement forward. Again, I never said no. When I was asked to headline Evolution, I was hesitant. Nikki Bella was a sure thing Hall of Famer, but I was just passing through. I asked the higher-ups to slate Charlotte Flair and Becky Lynch as the headliners, as the two were future Hall of Famers and were in the middle of an epic feud, but my request was denied. The justification was that Nikki Bella and I were the only names recognizable outside the company, meeting in the ring for the first time. Charlotte versus Becky had already been done what felt like 1,000 times. WWE's creative team convinced me that in order to slay a giant, first have to create one. To make my dropping the belt mean something, I had to elevate myself within the WWE as a once-in-a-generation wrestler, not a one-off champion. Evolution was the perfect platform. Backstage, it was as if you were walking through the history of women in the organization. They called us all together for a photo before the show. Standing between the women who had come before me, dating back to the days of the WWF, and the women coming up from NXT, for the first time, I understood my place in this history. Around me were women who, across decades, had been fighting not only for their own place in this industry, but for all of ours. The feeling carried over to the crowd. There was something palpable to the energy, as if they wanted to see us succeed. Often in wrestling, fans try to hijack the show. When the crowd loudly voices its displeasure with the match itself and tries to take attention away from the ring. Occasionally, it's in the form of booing or cheering for wrestlers who aren't there. More often, it's insults and rude chants. I once heard fans chant, "We want beach balls," implying they'd rather be batting around beach balls than watching the match, to Bray Wyatt and Matt Hardy, two wrestlers who gave their everything every time they stepped into the ring. No matter who you were, no matter how much of your life and body you've given to entertain these people, fans won't hesitate to turn on you in an instant. But at Evolution, they were cheering for each and every match. It was the kind of event that drew dads proudly bringing their daughters, groups of mom friends on a night out, and teenage girls. There were girls bringing their boyfriends to wrestling and not the other way around. The pro wrestling crowd is known for being assholes, jeering as much as cheering. But for just one night, it felt like they wanted to support the women. Being there, you believe change wasn't just possible, but happening. Charlotte and Becky went before us. They put on a 5-star last woman standing match. They must have thrown at least 20 chairs into the ring. Theirs was a hard act to follow, especially a match with no gimmicks between a rookie, me, and semi-retired Divas-era champion returning to wrestling after having suffered a serious neck injury, Nikki. We were extremely limited in what we could do, and the pressure was on. Nikki and I had an incredible build-up to our match. I delivered the best promo of my career to that point, with the approval of Nikki, in the lead-up to Evolution. Nikki claimed that it was she who knocked down doors for women in the WWE. My reply was, the only door you ever broke down was a door to John Cena's bedroom, a reference to her former fiancé and WWE legend. There wasn't a jaw in the building that didn't drop. Our match had one thing others didn't: symbolism. It was the embodiment of the Divas era versus its next iteration as superstars, just as the men were called. The patriarchy versus the women's revolution. In the match, Nikki had an early advantage, aided by her identical twin Brie, taking the occasional and obviously expected cheap shot. But I battled back to the delight of the crowd and retained the Raw title. All the women in the show gathered at the top of the ramp to celebrate the night's achievement. Backstage, Nikki, who had wondered if she'd ever wrestle again after having broken her neck, threw her arms around me. "The Divas are dead!" she declared proudly. These were powerful words coming from her. Under the Divas distinction, despite all women had accomplished in the ring, they were still lauded more for their appearance than their performance. Until now. The titty-shaking era was over. The age of athleticism had begun. Walking out of the arena that night, you could not feel anything but hopeful. What I hoped to do more than anything was to help bring up the next star, and no one was better positioned for that role than Becky Lynch. Becky had the air of an underdog, a head full of red extensions and a face that looked even prettier when she scowled. A perfect fit for an industry centered around conflict and appearances. Her thick Irish brogue made you want to listen to her talk. She had passion on the mic that could make even WWE's rehashed, over-dramatized writing captivating. After Evolution, the plan was that we would build toward the two of us intersecting the following month at Survivor Series in the Staples Center, the very arena where I had first caught the eye of WWE brass. Days before our match, the women of SmackDown invaded the ring, led by Becky. Nia Jax threw a punch that actually connected, and Becky's face imploded. Blood gushed everywhere, her nose left visibly out of place, her orbital bone fractured. It was a viral moment for Becky that propelled her career to new heights, but there was no way she could be medically cleared for a match by the end of the week. WWE scrambled to slot in Charlotte Flair as Becky's replacement. We were tossing around ideas when I pulled out a kendo stick, a long bamboo cane used for martial arts training, but also occasionally as a prop in pro wrestling. "You're going to take this, and you're going to break it on me," I said. "And when it breaks, I want you to pick up another and keep swinging." Charlotte's eyes widened. There is no way to break a kendo stick without it hurting like hell. "I love it," she said. The crowd did too. We took them from hating to chanting "This is awesome" in minutes. My body was covered in huge welts. I limped out of the ring. Our brilliance quickly forgotten. The fans turned their energy and ire on me. "Fuck you, Ronda!" a fan shouted, coming inches from my face. Another person leaned over the barricade, flicking me off. "Fuck you, Ronda!" There was an absolute unrestrained anger directed my way. It was so real in the face of everything else being fiction. Being in my hometown, in the venue where I set the record for the fastest submission title defense in UFC history, made it even more personal. The crowd was peppered with signs saying things like, "Ronda, go home." I was home. This was my hometown. What they really meant was they wanted me out of the business. I was bruised, bloodied, and booed. I had just let myself get beaten with a kendo stick for their entertainment. I stared back at them, trying my best not to respond with "fuck you too." The predictability of my continued run had bred contempt. The same old "I'm gonna break your arm" promos they kept ordering me to regurgitate, and rumors I was already leaving didn't help. But it wasn't just that. I would never be a wrestler to them. No matter what I did, it would never be enough. It didn't matter what I had accomplished or what I had gone through and given up to get there. I represented privilege to them. I wasn't an indie darling they watched grow up like Becky. I was an outsider, stealing the spotlight away from those who paid their dues. When WWE fans had welcomed me with open arms, I let my guard down. I wasn't ready for the sucker punch of them turning on me. Nevertheless, I was back the next night on Raw, determined to show off my welts, deliver a fire promo I wrote myself, and defend my title in another open challenge. It couldn't have gone better. The taping went well, and that was all that mattered. Or so I told myself as we left the arena. We drove back to Riverside from the show, our typically hour-long drive taking more than double that. Delayed first by event traffic and then standard LA traffic. When we pulled into the driveway, something seemed off. We got out of the car, walking around the back of the house. Our donkey, Millie, and the goats were hiding in the barn. All of the goats but one. We discovered the body of our goat Rio, halfway eaten in a nearby creek bed. We had got home later than we typically did to put the goats away for the night, giving the coyotes the opportunity to pick off the littlest member of our herd. It collapsed to the ground in tears. Sweet little Rio. I had been so caught up in WWE, its fans, and its fake fighting that I let it take precedence over everything else in my life. My farm, my family, my future. I called Triple H and told him I was done being a babyface. I was no longer capable of playing the good guy. I was done smiling and shaking hands while being shit on. I wanted to be able to defend myself, to say what was on my mind. It was my turn to turn. But as hard as I pushed, WWE pushed back. It just wasn't yet time, I was told. We had to build it up further, the producer said. We needed to better develop the characters. They talked about it as if they were writing scripts for serious actors who wanted to know, what's my motivation for this scene, and not for people who were smashing each other through tables. I went out every week, night after night, and I sold falls, hits, and cheap shots like a fucking champ for WWE. But the fans hated it. The novelty of my arrival had worn off for everyone, including me. The story that WWE prides itself so much on telling was going nowhere. As months passed, I started to feel like WWE had sold me a bunch of bullshit. In January, on the day after Royal Rumble, I arrived at the arena to find that now the road to WrestleMania had begun. The producers realized that we'd have to kick things into overdrive to get where they wanted the story to go. The longer I spent in WWE, the more I became convinced that, in addition to being helmed by a megalomaniac, its creative team was made up of a room full of guys who were the kids in high school who waited until the last night to do a semester-long project, and not the able-to-pull-it-off whiz kid types. You're going to do a promo and an open challenge, the producer said, handing me a script. In an open challenge, anyone can request a title shot, right here, right now. He continued, Bayley's going to come out and challenge, you'll have a match, and then Becky is going to come out. As the winner of the previous night's namesake Women's Rumble, a 30-person match where the last one in the ring gets to challenge either the Raw or SmackDown title holder for the belt at WrestleMania, it was finally Becky's turn to challenge me. The writer handed me another page of dialogue. Then you and Becky are going to have an exchange. That's it, I asked, somewhere between sarcastic and incredulous. Doors had already opened, and fans were filing into seats. There was no way we could rehearse any of this in the ring. Yeah, I think so, unless, of course, Vince has any changes. I looked over the huge blocks of text that I was expected to be able to effortlessly recite in a matter of hours. There was no way I'd be able to memorize all of it, plus a match that we hadn't even come up with yet. I went to find Pam, better known as Bailey. She was describing the match in the hallway, but I couldn't retain anything. As a visual learner, it was just words to me. There's no way I can remember all of this, I said candidly. I need you to know the match. I have to try and memorize and salvage this newest vision of this sappy-ass promo in 5 minutes. It's okay, she said. I'll call it to you out there. In another, less chaotic moment, I would have been proud of myself for just how far I had come in acknowledging that I couldn't do it all on my own. Saying it out loud and letting someone else help, but considering there wasn't time to rehearse, there certainly wasn't any time for patting myself on the back over personal growth. Back in my dressing room, a writer knocked on my door. Just a couple of changes to the script, she said, handing it to me. I looked at the new lines highlighted in yellow. Do I really have to open with this? I asked. What's wrong? She asked. We ripped some of it from your autobiography. It just doesn't fit the situation. Please, don't make me say this. The writer shrugged. It's beyond my control. Not even the sounds of Joan Jett could get me excited for what was to come. I walked into the ring and picked up the mic. The crowd booed. I shared their sentiment. I hadn't joined the WWE to become America's sweetheart. I was as over it as the fans were. Before I'd even got out the first lines of dialogue, the crowd erupted in boos until I lowered my mic. Every time I opened my mouth to speak, they booed again. Guess I should have spent that time memorizing the match instead of this cringeworthy promo, I thought to myself. After an eternity of embarrassment on the level of a naked in class nightmare, Bailey's music hit and she came running out. We improvised the entire match, Bailey talking me through it whenever we came close enough for it to look like she was insulting me instead of giving me cues. The crowd hijacked the match, cycling through chants for wrestlers who weren't there. Every time I felt the pain of impact upon hitting the mat for their entertainment, resentment built. But I was trapped. I had no choice but to keep going. In the moments between movements, I alternated between trying to remember my lines for the promo with Becky that was set to follow and rage over the fact that I couldn't escape this ongoing public embarrassment live on television. I flashed back to the trapping feeling the Ultimate Fighter gave me. I wanted out. Becky came out to thunderous applause. She said her piece, I said mine, a second promo that I had written, not the writers. My voice filled with believable rage and disgust as I channeled my genuine feelings for the crowd into the dialogue. Becky glared back to me, then whispered, "Good job," under her breath. I could see the pity in her eyes, looking at me, thinking, poor naive girl got in over her head. Becky was a WWE lifer, and I was never more grateful that this was her burden to carry instead of mine. I started to count the days until I could leave. But my greatest in-ring embarrassment was considered a success, since it kept the momentum going from Mania and made the crowd adore Becky even more. I still had to wait another month for my heel turn. When Triple H asked me to commit from one WrestleMania to the next, his reasoning had been that the WWE builds storylines and rivalries from one Mania to the next. But the longer I spent in WWE, the idea that there was any kind of planning and forethought when it came to best utilizing talent was as rooted in reality as 90-pound Alexa Bliss being able to hold her own against me in an actual fight. The match between Becky and me was finally set for WrestleMania and billed as the main event. It would be the first time WrestleMania was headlined by women. But word came down that Vince didn't believe we could pull it off, just the two of us. No reasoning was given as to why he thought that to be the case, but he insisted Charlotte be added to the match. Charlotte was the epitome of what Vince McMahon thought a woman should be. A tall blonde with enhanced features and impressive lineage. Her father was WWE legend Ric Flair. She brought the wrestling IQ and the athleticism to make any match she dreamed up a reality. Driven to emerge from the shadow of her famous father, she had entered the industry with a chip on her shoulder and something to prove. It didn't matter if she was in front of a sold-out NFL stadium or a tiny crowd in Bangor, Maine. She was going to do a moonsault off the top turnbuckle onto the floor to get everyone, be it 100,000 or 100 people in attendance, to pop. Charlotte was one of the biggest names in WWE. Becky was its biggest rising star. But the two of them had already faced each other for what seemed like every other week for years. Not only that, but they were set to face each other again just before Mania. Charlotte and I were coming off a great match at Survivor Series. Now that Becky was back, the WWE Universe, as the company refers to their own fan base, was dying for a singles match between the two of us, the one they had been promised. However, Vince had declared it, so I sighed and accepted it. Finally, more than a year after I made my first WWE appearance, with only a month to go before my run ended, I made my heel turn. As Steph stood in the ring with Becky and Charlotte, I entered and raged. This turn was important to me. WWE higher-ups even let me write it myself. I did everything I could to respect this business, I shouted at Steph and the fans. I worked my ass off and exceeded every expectation. I poured my heart out and sacrificed my body for your entertainment. And what did you do? You booed me out of the Staples Center in Los Angeles, my home. It was the least acting I've ever had to do because I literally meant every word of it. I am done pretending, I continued. I am not your dancing monkey. Damn your fantasy. Damn the man. A dig at Becky's man tagline. Screw the woo. A shot at the chant that welcomes Charlotte into every arena. And no more Mrs. Nice Bitch. I turned, kicking Charlotte in the stomach. Becky swung the crutch she had been using as a prop for a fake leg injury. I caught it, slapped her, and started beating her in the corner of the ring before dropping her to the canvas and transitioning into an armbar. Charlotte moved as if to re-enter the action, then thought twice as I continued to unleash on Becky. The ref, who jumped in to keep us apart, kept relaying messages he was getting from the back via an earpiece under his breath. Vince says armbar her again, he said. So I did. The ref came close again. Vince wants another armbar. I wasn't feeling that far removed from the custom match wrestlers who shot matches at Santino's. The pieces were being rushed into place to set up a showdown between myself, Charlotte, and Becky. What had been sold to me as a masterpiece 12 months in the making was being scaled down to a cheap paint by numbers. What they didn't realize is that while they had long underestimated the women's division, I was a talented fucking artist. We all were. Over the weeks that followed, all the attention was on the women's division. It had never been hotter. We continued to hurtle toward WrestleMania. Building the tension between myself, Becky, and Charlotte so that it reached a breaking point was key. Fans had to believe we wanted not just to fight each other, but to destroy each other. Yes, Charlotte and I had bad blood ever since she slid in to replace Becky at Survivor Series. Yes, WWE had beyond belabored Becky versus Charlotte as rivals. But we'd been given 2 lines and were told to make a triangle. They wedged Charlotte, the SmackDown champion, into the narrative. As I already held the Raw title, the powers that be, i.e. the sycophants who do Vince's bidding, dictated that to raise the stake and overcompensate for us having vaginas, the winner of our match at WrestleMania would lay claim to not just one, but both titles. The concept felt hastily put together at best. The only good part was now that I had turned heel, I didn't have to pretend I didn't think everything was bullshit. The Raw on the Monday before WrestleMania was going to be crucial to set the stage. Becky, Charlotte, and I were set to face off against the Riot Squad, in a bit that served solely to segue into a backstage brawl where Becky, Charlotte, and I would be arrested, but even the cops couldn't keep us apart. At least, that's how it would look to the masses. The backstage would be filmed beforehand and be edited in as if it were live after the tag match. The whole concept had been dreamed up at the last minute by Vince, who was standing backstage giving direction, one of the few times I'd seen him out of his office or gorilla. Watching him throw it together was a rare glimpse into the genius behind his insanity. He knew where each person and each camera needed to be to execute his vision. It was the kind of sequence that takes weeks to put together for a movie, and Vince slapdashed it together in a matter of minutes. My role was to be forced into the back of a squad car with Becky, where we'd start kicking at each other until I kicked out the window. After the cops removed Becky, I'd stick my head out of the window to yell at Charlotte, who would knee me in the face. While Charlotte and Becky battled, I'd climb still cuffed into the front of the cop car to drive it, hands behind my back, into another cop car. The cops would pull me from the driver's seat, again throw me in the back, and I'd stick my head out shouting back at them as the car drove away. Make sense? The writer asked. It had been months since anything about this place made sense. Kinda, I said uncertainly. Great, we've got about 5 minutes, a producer said as various crew members rushed to set up the shoot. The sudden urgency wouldn't have been so frustrating if we hadn't been sitting around the arena for 6 hours asking about a plan. A police officer, whom I recognized from other illustrious roles such as security guard number 3 and No Way Jose's conga line dancer, cuffed me and shoved me into the back seat of the black sedan that was apparently the best they could do when it came to a last-second cop car fill-in. I rolled onto my back, and as I stared at the window I was supposed to kick out, realized that I knew what I was supposed to do next, but had no idea of how I was supposed to do it. Was I supposed to stick my head out of a broken window? There had been no guidance, no rehearsal, nothing. We have 5 minutes, echoed in my head, so I kicked. The glass shattered everywhere, leaving jagged shards jutting up like monster teeth around the frame through which I was supposed to stick my head out and get kneed in the face by Charlotte. The only way to stick my head out safely without risking impaling my jugular was if I kicked the frame too. I kicked a second time, aiming for the frame, but this time my foot slipped. I felt the jagged glass slice into my calf like a serrated dagger jabbing into my muscle. And that's when the producer yelled, "Cut!" "Okay, let's set up the next shot," he said. I stared in disbelief. Next shot? The only thing that tempered the anger rising inside of me was the feeling of blood rushing out of me. I looked down to see not a gash, but multiple holes in my left leg. As they reset the shot, I gestured to Paul Heyman, serving as both a producer and in-ring personality, and my only anchor to rationality amongst the chaos. "Hey, so don't freak out and don't let anyone know, but I need a towel," I said, gesturing to my leg. Heyman calmly relayed the message to my assistant Jen, who rushed off to find a towel. Filming resumed, and I stuck my head out the now frameless window, taking Charlotte's knee to the face like a fucking champ. "And cut," the producer said for a second time. "Are we done?" I asked. "Almost. We just need to shoot you stealing the car as you ram it into the other cop car." There was a pause and a look of consideration. "Well, just keep your hands cuffed behind your back for that since we're tight on time. Then we'll get you yelling out the back of the cop car as it pulls away. And that's it." As if these were totally ordinary things to execute without any kind of stunt training or rehearsal. Hands behind my back, blood dripping down my leg, I slid into the driver's seat and hit the gas until it rammed into the other fake police car in front of me. Moments later, my head missed slamming into the side of a bus by mere inches while I yelled out the window as my car was driven out of the shot. "Are we done?" I asked with slightly more urgency. "Yes, but we need you in the ring in 10 minutes for rehearsal. Doors are opening and we're going to lose access to the ring soon," the producer said to my back as I left my bloody towel in the cop car to sprint to the trainer's room. Trailed by drops of blood down the corridor, I burst into the small medical room, panting and pointing. "Can you stitch us up in 10 minutes? The trainer looked at me, with what I imagined to be the expression of a battlefield doctor who has seen enough to know when to ask questions and when to just get to work. He pointed me to the trainer's table and started pecking pebbles of broken glass out of my open wound. "We need 15 minutes, he said without looking up at either me or the clock. "Fuck," I said. Jen had followed me there. I turned to her. "Tell them I'll be 5 minutes late for rehearsal." The trainer was still picking glass out of my leg when the producer knocked on the door. "We have 5 minutes, he said. "You gotta sew me up so I can walk through this fucking tag," I told the trainer. With the wariness of a man who long ago accepted his input would be sought but not always followed, he grabbed a suture kit and sewed quickly. I could feel the crunch and sting of the remaining pieces of glass being squished in between my skin and calf muscle with the tightening of each stitch. I felt him cut the athletic tape over the protective wrap he wound around my leg, jumping off the table before he even had a chance to say done. I ran to the ring for 5 minutes of rehearsal before getting kicked out when the doors opened to let the fans in. We stood backstage talking through the match in a hallway until our music hit. The entrance music for our segment had already started by the time I burst into Gorilla. Emerging from the curtain on the other side, I went out and did the tag match. Unlike the organization, I was a goddamn professional. That night would go down as one of the best Mania go home referring to the weekly broadcast directly before a pay-per-view, segments ever. The plan, I had been told in the weeks leading up to WrestleMania, was that we would figure the match out once we got there. What I didn't realize was when they said once we got there, they literally meant when we arrived at the actual event. With the historic first women's main event of WrestleMania on the line, it wasn't until the night before that we even met to start throwing around ideas with a producer. And then maybe from the double armbar, you guys could pick me up for a powerbomb, I suggested at one point. A powerbomb is a move where you lift your opponent so that she is sitting on your shoulders, then slam her to the ground hard. You can't do a powerbomb, the producer chimed in. The guys are doing a powerbomb before your match. Of course, I said in a tone that meant that's bullshit. It boggles my mind that a men's undercard match could call dibs on powerbombs over the women's main event. We did it anyway. Even though I had continuously lowered my expectations, it was as if WWE viewed it as a game of limbo, going lower every time. I realized that on the eve of my pro wrestling swan song, I didn't feel excited, just exhausted. A few hours later, Trav and I were sitting at the WWE Hall of Fame ceremony, dressed to the nines. I watched as my friend and fellow wrestler Natalya and her uncle, WWE legend Bret Hart, accepted the induction on behalf of the Hart Foundation. Out of the corner of our eyes, someone started running toward the ring. A crazed fan was sprinting for Bret. Trav was already on his feet, heading up the stairs of the ring before the guy got under the ropes. Trav grabbed the railing to propel himself forward, but in true WWE fashion, it was a gimmick railing that immediately buckled. Trav stumbled to a knee. The fan tackled Bret to the ground, but before anything could happen, Trav was back on his feet. "Get him!" I screamed. I watched my UFC heavyweight human weapon of a husband rip the fan off Bret and jump on top of him. "Trav!" I screamed even louder. "Don't kill him!" Bret was fine. The fan survived. The show went on. But it did not escape me that everyone was so lost in their fantasy world that when shit got real, my husband was the realest motherfucker in the room. Everyone froze. Everyone except Travis Brown. I was reminded of The Alchemist, where the protagonist goes on a long quest only to find that the treasure he's been searching for had been right next to where he was sleeping the night he dreamed of going on this journey. I looked at my husband in the seat next to me as the shocked murmuring of the crowd faded. I'd finally realized I already had everything I ever wanted. He was the treasure. I was ready to go home. Waking up the morning of my first WrestleMania, I felt like a kid on Christmas morning. This go-around, WrestleMania dawned like Christmas Eve. Just get through this one last day. It was a long fucking day. By the time I stormed down the ramp to the sounds of Joan Jett, who WWE had actually flown in to perform Bad Reputation for my walkout live, the best part of the entire day, it was after midnight. I'd love to say that we came out and put on the greatest show anyone had ever seen. That would be a lie. We did our absolute best to sell the hell out of it, but in the end, the match was good but not great. Last Mania had taught me there is a level of excellence that can't be achieved without putting in the preparation it takes to get there. Halfway through the match, I threw a punch at Becky, but connected with her elbow. It was immediately apparent that I had broken my hand. Since there was nothing I could do, I pushed it out of my mind and kept going. I had one job: lose. Charlotte got me in the leg lock looking for the win, but Becky broke it up. Together, we put Charlotte through a table, leaving just the two of us in the match that always should have been. We met in the middle of the ring, and I let loose with both hands. I was pulling my punches, but it hurt like hell. I moved in on Becky as if I was going to finish her with my finisher, Piper's Pit, but she countered, holding my shoulders to the canvas for the win. In order to walk away from WWE, I had to fall to the ground and let Becky pin me for an overly exaggerated count of 3. I had also reached a point where I could not only accept walking away on a loss, but also embrace it. My entire athletic career had been built not just by me winning, but by other people losing. The fear of losing had driven me to excellence. I had achieved things that no one else ever believed possible. But losing had also crushed me. It haunted me. It had almost broken me. Now, I watched proudly as Becky lifted the titles over her head. As I slipped backstage after that final match, losing provided me a door through which I could quietly exit as I moved on to the next chapter of my life. 13. As soon as I walked out of the ring after WrestleMania, everyone wanted to know if I'd be back. When I had signed my contract a year and a half earlier, I had assumed wrestling would be a brief, one-time thing. I stayed much longer and accomplished much more than I had ever imagined. But I still couldn't help but feel as if I was walking out of the stadium leaving something unfinished. Maybe our WrestleMania main event fell so short of my expectations that I didn't want to accept that was how my wrestling career would end. Maybe I saw there were barriers that were still left to be broken. Maybe I just wasn't ready to say goodbye. I felt like there was still more story to tell. It had been one of the most grueling years of my life, but it had also been one of the most transformative. WWE is not without its flaws. And by flaws, I mean some big fucking problems. But I had come to love pro wrestling in a way that I'd never expected. It had given me a new beginning when I thought everything I had worked for had come to an end. I would miss it, but I couldn't stay any longer. More than anything, what I wanted to do was have a baby. I had it all planned out. We'd go on a series of trips, impregnation vacations as I'd taken to calling them, a kind of last hurrah where we'd travel to cool places and have lots of unprotected sex. Like a baby moon, but I could still drink wine. It had been the carrot I dangled in front of myself to get across the finish line. The only significant post-WWE obligation I had was filming a 5-episode arc on 911, a network TV drama centered around first responders, slated for late summer. I'd filmed movies before and done a couple of guest spots on TV series, but this provided a chance to experience working on a show as part of a cast without having to fully commit to joining the cast or even leave town since it was filming in LA. The 4-month hiatus between commitments would give me time to rest up and heal up. I shattered my pinky knuckle clipping Becky on the elbow mid-Mania match, requiring surgery that my doctor shish kebabbed my shattered knuckle together with a pin. But I had one final media appearance, promoting the video game Mortal Kombat 11, where I was the voice of Sonya Blade on The Late Show with Stephen Colbert. I was driven straight from the hospital to the airport, boarding a flight before the anesthesia had even worn off. Dressed in a black leather jumpsuit, my hand throbbing in my lap, I smiled through my 5-minute appearance. That night, alone in a Manhattan hotel suite, I lay in bed thinking about the future. A seemingly offhand conversation I had with Paul Heyman, not long before I left WWE, floated up somewhere from the back of my mind. "I'd love to direct you in a movie one day," he said, seemingly out of nowhere. "What kind of movie?" I replied. "Whatever you want." It was an interesting idea, more of a thinking game than an offer, but it got me thinking. My passion for fight choreography was still there, and WWE made me even better at it. Since my UFC losses, I'd been feeling sorry for myself because no one was handing me my greenlit breakout role. I decided to take my destiny into my own hands, to write my own role. Later that afternoon, I wrote a short summary. Wanted assassin on the run finds out she's pregnant, fights her way through enemies to an abortion clinic, but by the time she reaches the clinic, all the threats she overcomes together with her unborn child convinces her she's capable of protecting and wants to have the baby. Then I forgot all about it. Now, weeks later, lying in bed, trying to will myself to sleep before an early flight home, the opening scene struck me. I ran over it in my mind again and again. My fear of forgetting it was keeping me up. I sat up in bed. Fine, I bargained with myself. I'll just write down this one damn scene that I'm getting some rest. My motion restricted by my cast, I started typing using only my thumbs as I poured my ideas into the notes app on my phone. I was still awake and typing 5 hours later when my car arrived to take me to the airport. I wrote all the way to the airport, as I waited in the airport, on the plane. The in-flight map showed we were somewhere over Nevada when I finally typed the words, "The end." I looked at the metrics on my phone. I've been writing for 11 hours straight. I had no idea how to write a screenplay, but apparently there was a story in me waiting to be told. I sent the rough 60 pages of block text to my agent, Brad, to see if he could connect me with a real writer to refine it. He quickly replied, I hate it when you use the word cunt. I read the subtext. I had a lot of work to do. But I was excited to have discovered a passion for something I didn't know was there. Something I never would have discovered if I kept my mind buried in pro wrestling. Despite my best efforts, being back in the limelight in WWE had brought back my MMA-era obsessive anxiety. Quiet moments were again wrought with intrusive thoughts. This time, instead of trying to distract myself by falling into the destructive rabbit holes of the internet, I channeled that energy into screenwriting, devouring books and interviews on the subject when I wasn't writing. It became an unexpected answer to my disordered thinking. Anytime my mind would drift towards self-criticisms or regrets about the past, I would redirect my focus toward my screenplays, harnessing my self-destructive tendencies to create instead of harm. That summer, as I recovered physically and mentally, catching up on a year's worth of sleep, Rousey acres continued to grow. In addition to the dogs, chickens, ducks, goats, and donkey, we'd added 2 Wagyu steers in Riverside when our cattle breeder mentioned the ranch next to his in Oregon was up for sale. It was a scenic 660 acres with 4 ponds, 2 creeks, and natural springs, but it needed work. The grassland had been taken over by invasive juniper. The pastures overgrazed and mismanaged to the point there was more bare dirt than grass. Already having 2 boys and now planning to bring a baby into the world shifted my perspective when it came to the future. I was no longer just thinking about my future, but theirs. What kind of world were we creating for our children? Regenerative ranching was one of the solutions I was most enamored with. How the animals are managed to sequester carbon, build soil, make the land into an ecosystem instead of a meat factory. We took the plunge and bought the land, investing the money I made in WWE into our herd of Wagyu. It was the first time since fighting that Trav and I found a new passion we could share. But before I could go all in on screenwriting, baby raising, cattle ranching, or considering a WWE comeback, I had to film 911. A few weeks before the shooting was set to start, Trav wanted to go on a hunting trip. He was an avid hunter and had been counting the days until I was done wrestling, when he could leave town for a few days and someone else, i.e. me, could take care of the small menagerie we'd assembled on the Riverside farm. I was still very much enjoying the novelty of not living out of a suitcase, so I sent him off, assuring him that I would be fine. He gave me that unsaid look between couples that asks, "Do you mean it, or is this a test?" The next week, he went out before the sun was up, kissing me goodbye before he went. The next few days weren't all that different from the last few months. I slept and ordered delivery. Despite the downtime, I realized that I was suddenly feeling more tired instead of less. I mentioned it to my mom on the phone. "Maybe you're pregnant," she said offhand. I laughed, and then it hit me. Maybe I was pregnant. Could I be pregnant? I took a drugstore test and waited as a faint line appeared. It was positive. Gonna have to change that impregnation vacation to an incubation vacation, I thought to myself. Secretly, I was disappointed at getting pregnant so fast. I was looking forward to Trav and I getting some us time. The window to revel in my freedom passed in a blink of an eye, and I was alone at home without anyone to share the joy of being pregnant with. The hormones and loneliness got to me. In tears, I called Trav. The words rushed out. How I'd been waiting a year to finally spend time with him, and the first thing he does is run off on a hunting trip. How he'd left me alone. How it was so messed up. "I can come back," he said. "Just stay," I said, more exasperated at myself than at him. This, too, I reminded myself, was something that I had wanted. Trav once told me that he hoped when I did get pregnant that I would surprise him with the news and film it. I ordered a onesie with a picture of a sperm on it that said "Dad's fastest swimmer" and hid it. Then I waited for him to come home. 2 nights later, I heard his diesel engine truck come down the road. Then the crunch of its tires pulling into our gravel driveway. "Hello?" Trav called out as he opened the door tentatively, uncertain as to whether he would encounter the version of me who had enthusiastically encouraged him to go or the one who yelled at him for doing so. "Hi," I said cheerily. I was trying to play it casual, convinced my face would give everything away. "I got you a surprise. It's in your bow case," I gestured. "Aw, babe, you shouldn't have," he said. He walked over, opened the case, then paused as he saw the onesie. "We're going to have a baby?" Trav asked. His eyes welled up, making everything feel real. "We're going to have a baby," I said, a giant smile spread across my face. He was ecstatic. I realized in the moment, coming to terms with the life-changing enormity of what this meant. I did all the things you're supposed to do when you find out you're pregnant. I called my doctor and made an appointment. I started taking prenatal vitamins. I stopped drinking alcohol, stopped smoking weed, stopped eating raw fish and deli meat. I downloaded an app that every week updated the size of a baby to a comparable kind of produce. The first time we heard the heartbeat, I cried. Sitting on the swing on our back porch, we FaceTimed our families and shared the news. I started talking to my stomach and reading books out loud to it. I started imagining what the baby might look like, whether it was a boy or a girl. I thought ahead to how we were supposed to start filming 911 and how cool it would be to one day tell my kid the story about how I scaled a Ferris wheel with them in my belly. My first 911 episode centered around a tsunami hitting Santa Monica and its aftermath. We headed just across the border into Mexico to shoot at the studio that was actually initially built to film Titanic. So it had these huge water tanks. First take of the day, I had to open a boat door, step out, and deliver my lines while throwing prop debris off the boat. The boat door opened up, not out, and I was just a little too short to fully push it up. So I would need to give it a little extra shove at the end. The cameras rolled, I pushed the boat door up, it opened, I stepped through. Just as I walked through the door, it teetered on the edge, but instead of tipping open, it slammed shut again, right down on my hand. The pain was immediate as I pulled my hand back. I could hear the internal back and forth playing out between my body and mind. Fuck, that really hurt, I said to myself. Don't be a pussy, I replied. With a skill forged through my judo and MMA careers, I pushed the pain aside and went through the scene as if nothing had happened, delivering my lines without missing a beat, and throwing random things off the boat as the script called for. The director yelled cut. I looked down at my left hand. My middle finger was being held on by a thread of tendon and the latex glove covering it. Just below the top joint, my finger had been severed from my hand. I grabbed my hand to hold my finger on, then turned to the director. You guys are not going to like this, I said, my voice completely calm, but my finger is off. What? He replied. My finger is no longer attached to my hand. What? A chorus of people in the general vicinity exclaimed. The reaction around me was equal parts disbelief and horror as I held up my hand. Several looked away in disgust. Sitting in the dark in the hospital after surgery, I couldn't believe how selfish and careless I'd been. How fucking stupid am I? I berated at myself, racked with guilt. I got pregnant, and all I was concerned about was how I didn't get enough time to dick around beforehand. I was more concerned about how cool I thought I'd be shooting action sequences while pregnant and not about how dangerous it would be for the baby. I'm already the worst fucking mom ever to a clump of cells. How the hell am I going to take care of an actual human? The surgeon put me in a removable cast I could take off to finish filming. But it wasn't until I saw the baby's heartbeat on the screen a few days later that I felt any relief. I was back on set days later. The stitches in my hand throbbed when I removed the cast. A few weeks later, I was called to set to film a fight scene. In addition to being a firefighter, my character was involved in an underground fight ring because, who isn't? Fortunately, my opponent in this scene was someone who would do whatever he could to make me look like a badass. My character would be taking down a 6'7", 250-pound fighter portrayed by a fighter I knew well because I was married to him. We quickly choreographed and shot the fight scene. I put the cast back on and we went home. My injured hand throbbed as I rested my good hand on my stomach, rubbing it gently. That night, my stomach cramped. The next day, I started bleeding. I called my doctor in panic. In a calm and kind doctor voice, she informed me that while light bleeding isn't uncommon in the first trimester, it's often the first sign of a miscarriage. The cramping worsened. I tried to stay calm, to remain positive. But the more I bled, the more I felt the future I'd started imagining fade away. I went through every stage of loss within the next few hours. Denial. It's just implantation bleeding. Anger. This is all my fault. Bargaining. Maybe there's something the doctor can do to stop this. Depression. I sat on the floor of the shower, puking and crying, lacking the strength even to stand. And when finally, in the bathroom, I felt the clump of cells slip out, acceptance. I had miscarried. My pregnancy was over. Travis held me as we stared at the bowl. This clump I had personified, sang to, talked to, and read to for weeks was the physical embodiment of all my hopes and dreams to be a mother. I wiped my eyes and flushed it down the toilet. My doctor assured me that it wasn't the injury that caused it, that 20% of pregnancies miscarry before week 10, which is overwhelmingly due to there being some kind of genetic abnormality that isn't conducive to life. But to this day, I feel like it was my fault, that in some way, my narcissism had killed my baby. No matter what anyone says, there's a part of me that will never forgive myself. Production wrapped, and I shut down. In retrospect, but unrecognizable in the moment, which I guess is the definition of retrospect, I handled it the same way I handled my fighting losses, which is to say, I was devastated and depressed. I hid from the world. I drank a lot and I smoked a lot and I didn't give a fuck. I was angry, mostly at myself. Trav let me be sad, but again refused to let me fully withdraw from the world. It'll happen, he assured me. But I felt broken. Time passed and the ache became worse. Each day was bringing me closer to a due date that would never come. Every notification from the baby tracking app telling me what size fruit my never baby would have been made me hate myself until I deleted it. I moved through the holidays like a ghost. On New Year's Eve, Trav held me close. This is going to be our year, babe. He, like all the other optimistic people on the planet, said as the clock struck midnight, 2020 is going to be the year. It was the first week of January when I went to hang the new calendar on the kitchen wall and realized my period was late. I took a pregnancy test, but when the line showed up positive, I felt hesitation, not happiness. Whether it was a second sense or self-preservation, I knew not to get my hopes up. I wasn't taking good care of myself. There was no reading or talking or singing this time. When the doctor was unable to find a heartbeat at the 10-week checkup, I was simply unsurprised. After a referral, I found myself sitting in a tranquil waiting room of a fertility doctor, decorated in muted tones that looked as if it were straight off a spa inspiration Pinterest board as the world outside started talking about this COVID virus. As I waited, I couldn't help but feel I had been misled in every sex ed class I'd ever had about how easy it is to get pregnant and find yourself unexpectedly with a baby. I was surprised how nervous I felt, but this new doctor's confidence was contagious. I reviewed your records, and from what I see, I don't have any serious concerns about your ability to have a baby, he said. He had little doubt that if I was a bit more mindful of taking care of myself, I'd have no problem having a baby. But, he added, if you want to have 3 or 4 kids like you mentioned, and you're having trouble now, I would recommend we look at IVF. I was only in my early 30s, but just a few years away from what the medical field calls a geriatric pregnancy. Because there's no clearer reminder of how society views women than to remind us that as soon as we're past childbearing age, we're basically old and shriveled. When I left his office, I felt better for the first time in a long time. I walked in feeling helpless and defeated, but had walked out with a plan. And as an athlete who had spent decades training, executing plans was my forte. IVF, as I came to learn, involves a lot of blood drawing, a lot of hormone injections, and a significant amount of having things shoved up your vagina. The point of the process is to get your body to produce as many eggs as possible, not just the standard one it typically releases each month. This is done by jabbing yourself regularly with hormone shots to stimulate your ovaries. Then you go in for them to harvest the eggs. Scientifically, this is called an egg retrieval, which should serve as your reminder here that this is my IVF recap and not any kind of legitimate medical literature. During the process, you are put under while they shove some kind of medical vacuum, not the scientific term, up your vagina, through your uterus, and into your ovaries where they get the eggs. The eggs are then fertilized and ideally turn into viable embryos. Except, I would come to learn, a lot of them don't. My first cycle, they were able to get 6 eggs, which to me sounded like a lot. That's 6 months worth of trying to get pregnant in a single shot. But the fertilization ended up with just 1 embryo. And even then, my doctor thought it only had a 50% chance of developing further. He recommended we take a break for a few weeks, then do a second cycle. As many as it takes, I said. The 2-hour drives to the clinic and back passed in a blur of Tesla Autopilot and Lord of the Rings on audiobook. 4 cycles later, we had 5 girls and 3 boys, all with a genetically tested, clean bill of health. Now it was time to transfer one in and wait for a baby. I was equal parts excited and terrified. Everything I had worked so hard for the last year had been leading up to this moment, but it did not escape me that the world was still in the middle of a global pandemic, with a new record number of deaths spiking every month. No one yet knew the effects of COVID during pregnancy. I was terrified. Not only that, but a large chunk of the population wasn't. As I approached pregnancy in a pandemic, it turned out the hermit skills I had been mastering the past few years finally came in handy. We did the embryo transfer over the holidays, just after the first COVID Christmas. The wait between laying legs in the stirrups, having the embryo inserted via the medical equivalent of a turkey baster shoved up my vagina, and the confirmation that the procedure was a success was the longest 10 days of my life. Just after the new year, we got confirmation that the transfer was a success. When at long last, I heard the words, "Congratulations, you're pregnant," from my doctor himself, it became real. The doctor put my due date at September 23rd, 2021. I did the math immediately to see how long I would have to get back in shape for a return to the ring at the 2022 Royal Rumble. 14. My water broke on my due date, and as Trav and I drove to the hospital, I was adamant that it would be an unmedicated natural childbirth. It was evening when we arrived at the labor and delivery ward. It may be a little...
All right. That is the end. We start on chapter 14, where it ended here. We will resume with part 3 of Ronda Rousey, Our Fight, a Memoir Book Audio 2024. This is getting real good. Now we at the part where Ronda Rousey talks about where she ends her MMA career in UFC and she begins her WWE career, where she starts her debut match at WrestleMania 34 in a mixed tag team with Kurt Angle against Triple H and Stephanie McMahon. And later on begins motherhood and becomes a mom for the first time. But definitely we'll catch on to that on the next part of the audiobook. But definitely interesting audiobook thus far. The book debuted beginning of this month, which will be April 2nd that it debuted. So thank you all for checking out the audiobook. Definitely something interesting to look to watch. To listen to. But we'll come back here and put out the last part of the audiobook, which will be part 3. And this is WrestleMania weekend. We'll cover NXT Stand and Deliver and WrestleMania Night 1 and Night 2. And we'll also have the last part of the audiobook. Thank you guys once again for checking it out. Soon 2 videos will pop up for Red Carpet Ring. First will be NXT Stand and Deliver 2024 predictions. The next video will be top WWE champions of all time. Until then, it is O-U-T.